The Amazon rainforest covers 5% of our planet's surface. We have mapped less than 10% of its floor. In those deep green waters, expeditions don't just get lost, they vanish completely. Meals still sit on makeshift tables, journals remain open, crew members gone, bodies missing, explanation none. For centuries, these cases have baffled experts. They are floating puzzles that became legends, mysteries that science still cannot explain. Theodore Roosevelt's 1913 to 1914 River of Doubt expedition. The sound is the first thing that gets inside your head. It's not a quiet place, the Amazon. It's a constant screaming orchestra of life and death. A billion insects buzzing, monkeys howling in the canopy, strange birds calling out warnings. For a man used to the roar of political crowds, the silence of New York boardrooms, this was something entirely different. This was chaos. And for Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, this chaos was about to become a personal hell. It began not with a scream, but with a dream. After a devastating electoral defeat in 1912, Roosevelt was adrift. A man of action couldn't just sit still, so he turned to the last great blank space on the map that fascinated explorers, the Amazon rainforest. The Brazilian government offered him a trip to survey an uncharted river, a twisting black water vein deep in the jungle known only as the Rio da Duvida. The River of Doubt. The expedition started with all the pomp you'd expect for a former president. In December 1913, Roosevelt, his son Kermit, and a team of renowned American naturalists and Brazilian soldiers marched into the jungle with tons of equipment. They had fine china for their meals, gifts for indigenous leaders they hoped to meet, and a cinematographer to document their great adventure. The early days were almost leisurely. They collected butterflies and birds. Roosevelt was in his element, giving speeches around the campfire, the great hunter and statesman conquering a new frontier. But the Amazon doesn't care about your resume. The first sign of trouble was the rain. It wasn't like rain back home. It was a solid wall of water that fell for days, turning the forest floor into a sucking bog. Their clothes never dried. A damp, hot rot began to set into everything. Their food, their equipment, their spirits. The insects found them next. Mosquitoes clouded their faces, biting through their thick clothing. Tiny biting flies called piums left bloody spots on their skin. Ants would march through their camps at night, driving men mad with their bites. Then came the river itself. When they finally reached the River of Doubt and built their dugout canoes, they thought the hardest part was over. They were wrong. The river was a series of violent rapids, one after another. The heavy, clumsy dugouts would smash against hidden rocks. One moment they were making progress. The next, a canoe would be torn apart, its precious cargo of food and ammunition sinking into the dark water. They lost canoes, they lost time, they were running out of food. The slow burn of disaster was turning into a fire, rations were cut, men grew weak. Roosevelt, now in his mid-50s, was pushing his body far beyond its limits. One day, while trying to help guide a canoe through a rapid, he gashed his leg badly on a rock. The wound, festering in the tropical filth, became infected. He developed a savage fever. The man who once commanded the most powerful nation on earth was now shivering in a damp hammock, drifting in and out of consciousness. The expedition started to fracture. The Brazilian commander, Colonel Candido Rondon, was a man of iron discipline dedicated to the mission. But some of the native paddlers began to talk of desertion. In the suffocating green tunnel of the jungle, paranoia set in. One of the men, a volatile Portuguese-speaking trader named Julio, murdered another member of the expedition in a fit of rage over food, and then vanished into the forest, never to be seen again. The expedition wasn't just fighting the jungle anymore, it was fighting itself. Kermit Roosevelt, watching his father fade away, faced an impossible choice. Do they press on, down a river that seemed to get more dangerous with every mile, with a dying man in their care? Or do they stop, in the middle of nowhere, and wait for a rescue that would never come? Roosevelt himself, in a moment of lucidity, begged them to leave him behind. He told his son to save the others, that his life wasn't worth the entire expedition. The optimism of the first weeks was a distant memory, replaced by the grim calculus of survival. They pressed on. Starving, sick and exhausted, they ate whatever they could find. They killed monkeys for meat. They rationed their remaining food to a few handfuls of flour a day. Roosevelt's fever worsened. At night, delirious, he would recite poetry, fragments of speeches lost in a world of his own making, far from the nightmare of the river. The maps they were making were no longer for glory or science. They were maps of their own potential tomb. Every bend in the river promised either salvation or another set of killer rapids. The sound of the jungle was now drowned out by the sound of their own laboured breathing and the ever-present terrifying roar of white water ahead. Richard Spruce's 1849 to 1864 expedition and mental deterioration. October 12, 1849, made camp on the banks of the Rio Negro. The humidity is unbearable. My papers stick to the desk, my ink runs, collected several specimens of a previously unrecorded fern. The silence here is different from the lower Amazon. It feels watchful. The words are neat, precise, the handwriting of a scientist. A man named Richard Spruce, a Yorkshire-born botanist, was not looking for gold or lost cities. He was looking for plants. For 15 years, from 1849 to 1864, he would wander the Amazon, collecting thousands of specimens. His mission was knowledge. But the Amazon has a way of turning knowledge into a burden and a quest into a prison. Spruce's story is told in his own hand, hundreds of letters, journals, and scientific notes. They start with the wide-eyed wonder of a naturalist in paradise. He describes the breathtaking beauty of orchids, the complex social structures of ants, the sheer scale of the biodiversity. Every page is filled with meticulous observations. He learns indigenous languages, earns the trust of local communities, and maps areas no European had ever seen. For the first few years, his writings are a testament to human curiosity and endurance. But slowly, a different tone begins to creep into the entries. The weather is no longer just an inconvenience, it is a relentless enemy. The rain has not ceased for 22 days, he writes in 1852. Everything is mouldering. My clothes, my boots, my very soul feels sodden and heavy. He begins to document his own physical decline with the same detached eye he uses for his plants. Fevers rack his body. He suffers from bouts of malaria that leave him shivering under a thin blanket miles from any doctor. The isolation starts to etch away at his mind. In one letter to a colleague in England, he confesses, "I sometimes go weeks without speaking my own tongue. I converse with the natives in broken Tupi, but the words feel hollow. I fear I am forgetting the sound of intelligent conversation." His entries become less about discovery and more about survival. He details his dwindling supplies, his struggles to preserve his plant specimens in the suffocating damp, his constant battle against insects that eat his papers and his collections. In 1855, he was tasked with a new mission, to collect seeds and young plants of the cinchona tree, the source of quinine, the only known treatment for malaria. It was a crucial mission, but it took him even deeper into the most remote and treacherous parts of the Andes, on the fringes of the Amazon basin. He succeeded, but the cost was immense. He spent months in cold, foggy mountains, his body weakened by the previous years in the jungle. His health broke completely. The later journals are difficult to read. The neat handwriting becomes a shaky scrawl. The entries get shorter, sometimes just a few words. Fever returned. Cannot keep food down. The pain in my joints is unbearable. The brilliant botanist is gone, replaced by a chronicler of his own suffering. He writes about vivid, terrifying dreams. He describes seeing figures in the jungle that weren't there, hearing voices in the rustle of the leaves. The line between observation and hallucination begins to blur on the page. He doesn't write about the beauty of a flower anymore. He writes about the futility of his work. "I have collected 10,000 specimens," he scrawls in one desperate entry from 1859. "And for what? They will sit in a museum in London and no one will know the price that was paid for them. No one will know the silence." The mission had become a sentence. The jungle, once his laboratory, was now his asylum. He was a prisoner of the very knowledge he sought, trapped in a vast green cell of his own making, and the walls were closing in with every passing day, every shaking fever, every silent, watchful night. The Amazon rubber boom atrocities from 1879 to 1912. It started with a simple accident in a laboratory in Massachusetts. In 1839, a man named Charles Goodyear was experimenting with a strange sticky substance from the Amazon called caoutchouc. It was temperamental. It melted in the heat and cracked in the cold. But one day, he accidentally dropped a mixture of this substance and sulfur onto a hot stove. Instead of melting into a mess, it hardened into a durable, flexible, and perfectly stable material. He called the process vulcanization. The first domino had been tipped. That hardened piece of rubber on Goodyear's stove would set off a chain reaction that would echo thousands of miles away in the deepest parts of the Amazon basin, with consequences more brutal than any laboratory experiment. The world was rapidly industrializing, and it suddenly had an insatiable hunger for this new material. Bicycle tires, carriage wheels, waterproof clothing, and finally the automobile. Every new invention needed rubber, and the only place to get enough of it was from the vast, untapped forests of the Amazon, from the milky sap of the Hevea brasiliensis tree. The second domino fell with the price. The value of rubber skyrocketed. Almost overnight, remote jungle outposts like Manaus and Iquitos were transformed from sleepy river towns into fantastically wealthy cities. Opera houses were built with Italian marble in the middle of the rainforest. Barons imported champagne and silk from Europe, building lavish mansions where they would famously light their cigars with $100 bills. But this glittering wealth was built on a foundation of unimaginable cruelty, a system of horror that reached back into the jungle along every river and tributary. The third domino was the method. To get the rubber, you needed seringueiros, rubber tappers, but there weren't enough willing workers, so the barons, the caucheros, devised a system. They would send agents into the interior to indigenous villages that had lived in isolation for centuries. These agents would offer gifts, make promises, or simply use force. They would bring entire villages, now indentured labourers, deep into the territory of a specific rubber baron. They would advance them tools, food, and supplies from the company store at inflated prices, creating a debt that was mathematically designed to be impossible to repay. This was debt slavery, known as enganche, the hook. Once hooked, the tapper and his family were trapped. He was given a quota of rubber to meet each month. The work was relentless and isolating. A tapper would spend days alone in a section of the forest, making cuts in dozens of trees, collecting the latex in cups, and then smoking it over a fire to form a solid ball. The smoke was acrid and poisonous, damaging the lungs. The jungle was full of disease, malaria, yellow fever, beriberi. But the real danger wasn't the environment, it was the overseers. The fourth domino was the violence. If a tapper failed to meet his quota, the punishment was severe. The barons employed armed guards who ruled through terror. Whippings were common. Men were stretched between trees and beaten until their skin was shredded. There were stories of workers being crucified or burned alive, but the most infamous atrocity was the practice of severing ears. Guards would cut off a man's ears as proof to the baron that punishment had been administered for a low rubber yield. Some barons demanded a basket of ears for every basket of rubber that was short. The horror was systematic, and it was quantified. The chain reaction spread like a virus up every river. The Putumayo region in Peru became one of the most notorious zones of terror, controlled by the Peruvian Amazon Company, a British-registered entity. Their methods were so brutal that they sparked an international scandal. A report by the American engineer Walter Hardenberg and later an official investigation by the British diplomat Roger Casement detailed the scale of the genocide. Indigenous people were shot for sport, their heads bashed in with rifle butts. Children were used for target practice or had their brains dashed out against trees. Women were systematically raped and tortured. It was estimated that for every 4 tons of rubber produced in the Putumayo, 1 human life was lost. The population of the region, once numbering in the tens of thousands, was reduced to a few shattered remnants. The final domino in this terrible sequence fell in the faraway jungles of Southeast Asia. An Englishman named Henry Wickham managed to smuggle thousands of Hevea brasiliensis seeds out of the Amazon in 1876. They were carefully germinated at Kew Gardens in London and then shipped to British colonies in Ceylon and Malaya. There, they were planted in orderly, easily accessible plantations. The rubber could be harvested efficiently without the brutal logistics of scouring a vast wilderness. The Amazon's monopoly was broken. The price of rubber collapsed almost overnight. The barons in Manaus and Iquitos went bankrupt. The opera houses fell silent. The mansions crumbled. The flow of wealth stopped. But for the tens of thousands of indigenous people and mixed-race caboclos who'd been enslaved, the end of the boom meant little. They were left with nothing, their villages destroyed, their families dead, their world irrevocably shattered. The jungle slowly began to reclaim the abandoned rubber trails and the crumbling trading posts. The screaming had stopped, leaving only a deep, enduring silence and the ghosts of a million lives sacrificed to the world's demand for a product that started with a simple accident on a hot stove. Richard Mason's 1961 death by the uncontacted Penara tribe. The Penara tribesmen found the stranger on the riverbank. He was weak, feverish, and alone. He had been wandering for days, maybe weeks, after fleeing his own expedition. His name was Richard Mason, a 32-year-old British explorer, and in that moment, he had no way of knowing that his story was already over. The tribesmen did not see a man, they saw a portent, an anomaly, a threat. Or perhaps, in the brutal calculus of the jungle, they simply saw meat. The story that would eventually trickle out from the deep Amazon was fragmented, filtered through language barriers and the stark, unadorned worldview of the Penara. They did not kill him immediately. They kept him for a while. They watched him. They saw his weakness, his strange appearance, his inability to provide for himself in their world. And then, according to the account that would later horrify the world, they decided he was more valuable as a lesson than as a prisoner. Richard Mason was killed, butchered, and eaten. His heart, it was said, was roasted and shared among the warriors. His skull was placed on a pole, a silent warning to other outsiders who might venture too deep. This is where the story ends for most. But to understand how a promising young explorer ended as a cannibal's feast, we have to rewind the tape. 2 years earlier, in 1959, Richard Mason was full of ambition. He was part of a new generation of adventurers, drawn not by rubber or gold, but by the sheer unconquered mystery of the Amazon. He had joined the Villas-Boas brothers, renowned Brazilian explorers and advocates for indigenous rights, on their groundbreaking mission to make peaceful contact with isolated tribes in the vast Xingu National Park. Mason was the logistics man, the tough, practical Englishman who could handle the boats, organize supplies, and endure the hardships. For a time, he thrived. He learned the rhythms of the river, the skills of survival, and he believed in the mission's noble cause. But the Xingu was a mosaic of different tribes, each with their own territories and complex, often hostile relationships. The mission's success with one group did not guarantee safety from another. In early 1961, Mason was tasked with leading a small, independent survey party to map a remote tributary, an area on the fringes of the known Xingu. It was supposed to be a routine trip. They had a boat, a few hired hands, and enough supplies for several weeks. But the Amazon has a way of turning routine into catastrophe. The first thing to go wrong was the boat. It hit a submerged log, tearing a hole in the hull. They managed to beach it, but the damage was severe. Their engine was useless. As they tried to make repairs, the weather turned. Torrential rain swelled the river and their damaged boat was swept away, taking with it most of their food and ammunition. They were stranded. The argument started then. Mason wanted to press on foot following the riverbank, believing they could reach a known settlement. His men, local woodsmen who understood the scale of the jungle better, argued they should stay put, build a shelter, and wait for a rescue party that the Villas-Boas brothers would surely send. The disagreement turned into a mutiny. Fearful and seeing Mason's determination as a death sentence, the men abandoned him one night, taking the last of the working firearms and what little food they had salvaged. They would eventually stumble, half dead, into a friendly village weeks later. Mason woke up alone. He was now a single, solitary man in an immense and unforgiving wilderness. But he was also stubborn, and his British pride refused to let him simply lie down and die. He started walking. He followed the river, as he had insisted they should. For days he managed. He found some fruit, caught a few small fish with his hands, but he was moving deeper into the territory of the Penara, a tribe known for their ferocity and their complete isolation. They were a people who had no reason to trust an outsider, a people for whom intertribal warfare and its associated rituals were a part of life. To them, enemies were not just killed, they were consumed, their strength absorbed, their threat eternally neutralized. Mason, by now delirious from hunger, thirst, and a mounting fever, likely had no concept of whose land he was on. He was just a man trying to find water. The Penara hunters found him easily. They watched the pale, stumbling ghost for a day before they moved in. There was no fight. He was too weak. They took him back to their village. What happened in the days that followed is known only to the Penara. Did they try to communicate? Did they see his sickness as a curse? Was his fate decided in a council? Or was it the impulsive act of a warrior? The answers died with those involved. The story emerged years later, after the Villas-Boas brothers made peaceful contact with the Panara in the 1970s. It was told not as a horror story, but as a simple factual event from their past. They had found a stranger. They had dealt with him in the way they knew. For Richard Mason, the chain of misfortune, a broken boat, a mutinous crew, a wrong turn, had led him to a riverbank where he ceased to be an explorer and became a cautionary tale, a fleeting mystery swallowed by the green, his final resting place not a grave, but the digestive tracts of the very people he'd come to the jungle to find. Percy Fawcett's 1925 disappearance searching for the lost city of Zed. We go into the unknown. No one knows what happened to us, and perhaps they never will. My companion is Raleigh Ramel, and I am Percy Fawcett. We are the only white men in this part of the country, and we are not coming back. The message left with a tribal chief was a final deliberate echo into the void. It was May 1925. The man who wrote it, Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett, was a legend in his own time, a decorated British artillery officer, a master surveyor of the Amazon, and a man utterly consumed by a single fixed idea. He believed a magnificent ancient city, a civilization he called simply Z, lay hidden in the unexplored jungles of Brazil. After this message, he, his elder son Jack, and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel walked into the tall grass along the upper Xingu River and vanished from the face of the earth. Their disappearance was not an ending, it was a starting pistol. To understand the gravitational pull of Fawcett's mystery, you have to hear from the man himself. His letters, published articles, and personal diaries are a map of an obsession. He wasn't a fool. He was tough, resilient, and deeply knowledgeable, having survived multiple solo expeditions through the most dangerous territories. But his experiences had convinced him he was right. He wrote of seeing strange carved stones in the jungle. He heard indigenous tales of a great white city of stone, where gold and treasure were commonplace. He became obsessed with a document called Manuscript 512, found in Brazil's National Library, which described a lost silver-rich metropolis discovered by Bandeirantes in the 1700s. Fawcett's Z was not just a city, it was his destiny. His letters home to his wife Nina chart this transformation from explorer to prophet. "I have seen the most extraordinary things," he wrote in 1921. "Things that make me believe the history of this continent is utterly wrong. I am close, Nina. So very close." He became secretive, coding his maps, convinced that rival expeditions and treasure hunters were watching him. He believed Z was a spiritual center, a place of immense power, and that he alone was worthy of finding it. His final expedition was to be his masterpiece. He took only his son and his son's friend, believing a small, dedicated party could move quickly and avoid the diseases and conflicts that plagued larger groups. He forbade them from bringing modern gadgets, relying on his own legendary survival skills. They carried only the essentials and an unshakable faith in the Colonel's vision. This is where the first narrative ends. The three men disappear. The silence descends, and then the second narrative begins, the story of the hundreds of people who followed Fawcett's ghost into the green. The first rescue mission was launched in 1928, led by American explorer George Miller Dyott. He found some tantalizing clues, a carved tribal marker Fawcett said he would leave, a story from the Kalapalo people about seeing 3 white men. They said the explorers were sick and starving, and that they had last seen them heading east, toward a territory inhabited by a hostile tribe. But Dyott's own expedition nearly ended in disaster, turning back just in time. He returned with no bodies, no proof, only more questions. The mystery deepened, and the legend grew. The next decade became a bizarre parade of the obsessed. A Swiss trapper claimed he found a skeleton with a gold dental bridge, which he said was Fawcett's, though the Colonel had no such bridge. A Brazilian psychic announced she had made telepathic contact with Fawcett, who was now living as the spiritual leader of a subterranean city. Then came the more tragic cases. In 1932, an American journalist, Albert de Winton, set out to find Fawcett and was never seen again. In 1951, a former Russian spy turned explorer Yuri Malinin vanished in the same region. The jungle was not just swallowing Fawcett, it was swallowing everyone who went looking for him. The most chilling parallel story is that of Fawcett's own family. His younger son, Brian, spent his life trapped in the shadow of his father's and brother's disappearance. He became a journalist, and every strange story, every rumour from the Amazon landed on his desk. He was forced to investigate countless hoaxes and heartbreaks, a man claiming to be his long-lost brother Jack, a tribe claiming to have raised Fawcett as a god. Brian wrote, "The search for my father has become an industry of madness. It has consumed my life just as it consumed his. He was a survivor of a tragedy that happened before he could even remember, living a life defined by an absence." The death toll continued to climb into the late 20th century. In 1996, the millionaire adventurer James Lynch mounted a multi-million-dollar expedition equipped with satellite phones and GPS. He was captured by a hostile tribe, stripped and held for days before a negotiated release. The jungle had humbled modern technology. A year later, a Brazilian guide named Olimpio Pinto was shot with arrows and killed while leading a Fawcett hunting party. The official estimate is that over 100 people have died searching for Percy Fawcett. The two narratives, Fawcett's own driven quest and the tragic pilgrimage of those who followed, are now permanently intertwined. One man's obsession became a vortex that pulled in the desperate, the greedy, and the dreamers. The letters from Fawcett's early expeditions, filled with hope and certainty, stand in stark contrast to the grim reports of those who went after him, reports of failure, madness, and death. He left behind no lost city, no treasure, no definitive answer. He left only a question, a blank space on the map that became a cemetery for the curious, a monument to the idea that some ghosts are best left unchased. Francisco de Orellana's 1541 expedition. The decision was born from a simple, brutal calculation: starvation. In the deep, unmapped Amazon of 1541, Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the conquistador who had toppled the Inca Empire, stood at the head of over 200 Spanish soldiers, 4,000 indigenous slaves, and a herd of pigs they had been slowly eating for months. They were lost, sick, and their supplies were gone. The jungle was closing in. So Pizarro made a fateful choice. He ordered one of his captains, Francisco de Orellana, to take 60 men and the one remaining brigantine downriver to find food. It was a logical move. It was the first domino. Orellana and his men pushed off, promising to return within days. But the river, which they would later name the Amazon, had its own plans. The current was stronger than anyone had anticipated. They sailed for days and found nothing but endless, identical green walls. Turning back against the powerful flow was impossible. They were trapped on a liquid highway leading into the unknown. The second domino had fallen. A mission for supplies had become a one-way journey. Back at the main camp, Pizarro waited. Days turned into weeks. Hope curdled into rage and despair. His men began to die from hunger and disease. The jungle provided little sustenance. They boiled their leather saddles and sword scabbards to make a thin, disgusting gruel. The decision to wait for Orellana, the third domino, was a death sentence for most of them. Finally, Pizarro was forced to admit the truth. Orellana was not coming back. He had to lead his ravaged army back the way they had come, a horrific retreat through nightmarish terrain. Meanwhile, Orellana's journey downstream became a surreal odyssey. They were carried for weeks on the immense river, witnessing things no European had ever seen. They passed enormous, thriving villages and encountered complex chiefdoms. But they were not explorers. They were fugitives on a raft. They fought skirmishes with warriors they described as fierce, tall women, giving rise to the legend of the Amazons that would name the river. Their brigantine was falling apart, riddled with termites. They had to build a new one from scratch, a monumental task for starving, exhausted men, forging nails from their own armour and using native guides to find pitch for caulking. Every bend in the river presented a new threat. Hostile tribes, treacherous rapids, the gnawing constant hunger. The fourth domino was the point of no return. Orellana and his men held a formal vote. Do they attempt the impossible task of marching back through hundreds of miles of jungle to find Pizarro, who was likely already dead? Or do they commit to the river, wherever it may lead? They voted to continue. It was an act of mutiny born of desperation, a choice that would forever brand Orellana a traitor in the eyes of those who survived Pizarro's camp. They were now sailing for their own lives, not on a rescue mission. The consequences of that vote now unfolded with terrifying speed. The river widened until they could not see the far shore. They were on a freshwater sea. Their food was gone. The fifth and most horrifying domino fell. The rumours began, first in whispered confessions centuries later. They had resorted to cannibalism. To survive, they allegedly drew lots, killing and eating one of their own. The story goes that they even devoured a servant who had died of natural causes. The expedition was literally consuming itself. The line between civilized men and savages, a line they believed they were crossing the ocean to defend, had been erased not by the jungle but by their own empty stomachs. Months after they had left Pizarro, Orellana's tiny, battered brigantine finally drifted into the Atlantic Ocean. Of the 60 men who had begun the river journey, only a handful remained. They were living skeletons, their bodies covered in sores, their minds shattered. They had accomplished one of the most incredible feats of exploration in history, the first navigation of the Amazon River from the Andes to the sea, but they carried with them the stench of betrayal and the dark secret of what they had done to survive. The final domino was the aftermath. Gonzalo Pizarro did somehow manage to lead a handful of his own men back to Quito. They arrived as ghosts, barefoot, dressed in animal skins, their weapons long since discarded. Of the more than 4,000 souls who had set out with him, fewer than 100 returned. When Pizarro learned that Orellana had reached Spain and was being hailed as a hero, his bitterness knew no bounds. He died a few years later, beheaded in a political struggle, his name forever tied to a catastrophic failure. Orellana's glory was short-lived. He secured a royal grant to return and colonize the lands he had discovered. But his second expedition was a mirror of the first, a cascade of disasters. His ships were separated, his men died of disease and attacks, and he himself, worn down by fever and failure, died on the banks of the great river he had named. The chain of events that began with a search for food had ended with both leaders dead, thousands of lives lost, and a legend of a green hell so powerful and consuming that it could make men betray their comrades and devour their own. Henry Walter Bates's 11-year expedition, 1848 to 1859. November 10th, 1848. Arrived at Paris. The verdure is overwhelming, a luxuriance I could not have conceived. The air hums with life. I feel as if I've stepped into another world, one of boundless possibility. The handwriting is neat, the tone brimming with the excited precision of a young man on the cusp of a great adventure. The author is Henry Walter Bates, an English naturalist of just 23 years. He has arrived in the Amazon with his friend Alfred Russel Wallace, armed with collecting nets, pins and spirit jars. Their plan is simple yet monumental, to gather evidence, specimens of insects and birds that might shed light on the great mystery of how species come to be. For the next 11 years, Bates would not just study the jungle, he would be consumed by it, and his own carefully kept notes would chart a course from scientific fervour into a chilling, lonely struggle with the mind itself. The early entries are a torrent of discovery. He describes the brilliance of butterfly wings with the awe of a poet, the complex social structures of ants with the eye of a philosopher. He details the staggering diversity, collecting over 14,000 species, more than half of which were new to science. He writes of the satisfaction of a good day's work, of carefully pinning a new species of beetle, of the camaraderie with Wallace. We are peeling back the layers of a great mystery, he writes in 1849. Every specimen is a word in a language we are slowly learning to read. But the first cracks begin to appear subtly. Wallace, plagued by ill health, decides to return to England in 1852. His departure is a devastating blow. Bates's journal entry is uncharacteristically brief. Wallace sailed today. The forest feels larger tonight. The silence, once filled with scholarly debate, becomes oppressive. He is now utterly alone, dependent on unreliable hired hands and the often grudging hospitality of remote rubber traders and village priests. The entries begin to include more than just scientific observations. He notes the constant draining humidity that rusts his equipment and mildews his clothes. He documents his first bouts of fever, the shaking chills and burning sweats that leave him weak for days. The tone of the writing slowly shifts. The wonder remains, but it is now tempered with a grinding fatigue. He writes of the psychological toll of the insects, not just as specimens, but as a constant maddening torment. The mosquitoes are a cloud of suffering, he scrawls in 1855. They find every inch of exposed skin. The piums are worse, their bites are tiny, persistent fire. There is no peace, not even in one's hammock. He describes nights spent listening to the cacophony of the jungle, a sound that once fascinated him but now feels like a siege on his senses. The most profound change comes in the content of his observations. He begins to document things that stray from the strictly scientific. He writes of hearing whispers in the forest when no one is there. He describes seeing fleeting movements at the edge of his vision, shapes that dissolve into the foliage when he turns his head. At first, he attributes this to the tricks of the light, the strange acoustics of the dense wood, but the references become more frequent, more personal. I find myself speaking aloud to the trees, he confesses in a letter to his sister that he likely never sent. It is not for company, but to prove that I still have a voice, that I have not been entirely swallowed by this green silence. His meticulous records of animal behaviour start to include a paranoid subtext. He becomes convinced that a certain species of monkey is following him, watching him from the high canopy. He writes not with scientific curiosity, but with a growing unease. They're always there, just out of sight. Their calls sound different now, less like communication, more like mockery. The jungle is no longer just a subject of study. It has become a sentient, watching adversary. The descent accelerates during a severe malarial fever in 1857. His journal entries from this period are disjointed, the handwriting a shaky scrawl. He writes of vivid, terrifying hallucinations, of giant serpents coiled around the legs of his table, of the faces of his family appearing in the knots of the wood on the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. He details a recurring dream where he is lost in a labyrinth of identical trees, and a voice clear and cold tells him he will never leave, that his bones will fertilize the soil for new, unnamed species. When the fever breaks, a profound change has settled in him. The excitement is gone, replaced by a grim, dogged determination. He continues his work, but it is now a compulsion, a ritual to keep the madness at bay. He writes, "I must focus on the work, the pins, the labels, the classifications. These are the only things that are real. The rest is just the forest trying to get in." After 11 years, Henry Walter Bates finally left the Amazon in 1859. He returned to England with one of the most significant natural history collections ever assembled, and his work would later provide crucial evidence for his friend Wallace's and Charles Darwin's theories of evolution. But the man who came back was not the bright-eyed youth who had left. He was quiet, prone to long silences, and would often startle at sudden noises. He had written the definitive account of the Amazon's natural life, but hidden between the lines of his great book, The Naturalist on the River Amazons, was another, more terrifying story. The survivor's account of a man who had journeyed so deep into the wilderness that he almost forgot the way back to his own mind. Aviation disasters during 1970s to 1980s, Amazon mapping expeditions. From 1,000 feet up, the Amazon looks different. It loses its terror and becomes a thing of breathtaking beauty. An endless, rolling carpet of green, broken only by the lazy, brown loops of rivers. In the 1970s, this was the new frontier of exploration. No longer would men have to hack their way through the vines and mud on foot. They could soar above it all, in the sleek metal cocoons of aircraft, with cameras that could map thousands of square miles in a single day. It felt like cheating nature, but the jungle has a long reach, and the sky above it is not a sanctuary. It is just another kind of wilderness. The work was routine, almost boring. Pilots for government mapping agencies and mineral survey companies would take off from airfields in Manaus or Belém, their planes loaded with specialized camera equipment and radar. Their flight plans were precise, linear grids that looked neat on a chart. They would fly back and forth over a designated sector, the camera humming steadily, capturing the unchanging sea of green below. For the first few hours of every mission, it was easy. The sun was bright, the radio communication with home base was clear, and the pilots felt like masters of a new domain. The first sign that this confidence was misplaced was the weather. Storms over the Amazon don't build slowly, they explode. One moment the sky is clear, the next, a towering wall of cumulonimbus clouds rears up, reaching 50,000 feet or more. These aren't just rain clouds, they are violent, churning monsters of wind, hail and lightning. For a small survey plane, there was no going over or around them. The turbulence inside could shake a plane apart. Pilots began reporting strange atmospheric phenomena, static electricity that would cover their windshields in a glowing purple light known as St. Elmo's fire, and sudden violent downdrafts that could slam an aircraft hundreds of feet downward in seconds. Then came the navigational gremlins. The vast featureless canopy was a navigator's nightmare. There were no landmarks, no roads, no distinct mountains. It was all just green. Compasses could behave erratically due to mineral deposits deep beneath the forest floor. The early forms of radio navigation were unreliable over such distances. A pilot relying on a dead reckoning could be off by just a few degrees, and after an hour that small error would mean they were dozens of miles from their intended position, lost over an ocean of trees. The slow burn of unease began. Pilots started double-checking their calculations. They carried extra fuel just in case. The routine was becoming a ritual of risk management. The incidents started to accumulate, each one a little more serious than the last. A plane would return to base with a story of an engine sputtering in a storm, of losing radio contact for a frightening half hour. There were forced landings on rare sandy riverbanks, where the crew would wait for days until a rescue float plane could find them. These were close calls, warnings that were heeded with stricter safety protocols. But the fundamental problem remained. Beneath the plane was a landscape that offered no place for a safe emergency landing. A forced descent meant a collision with a 100-foot-tall canopy of hardwoods, a violent tearing apart of metal and wood. The tension broke in the most definitive way possible: silence. In 1974, a C-47 survey plane on a mapping mission for the Brazilian government failed to return to its base. A search was launched, but looking for a downed aircraft in the Amazon was like looking for a single dropped coin in a vast green field. The search planes flew over the last known coordinates. They saw nothing, just green. The family of the crew was told the plane was missing, presumed lost. It was a phrase that offered no closure, only a void. Then it happened again and again. A small Cessna carrying a mineral prospector vanished in 1978. A twin-engine Beechcraft with a crew of 3 on a photographic survey disappeared from radar in 1982. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern: a final routine radio check. Then nothing. No distress call, no emergency locator beacon, just silence. The theories were plentiful. Sudden structural failure in a storm, a catastrophic engine fire, or perhaps they flew into a virtually invisible, isolated but massive thunderstorm cell that tore the wings off the plane. The most haunting case was that of Flight 201, a survey aircraft that vanished in 1989. This time, the crew had been in mid-sentence with air traffic control, reporting moderate turbulence. The transmission wasn't cut off, it just stopped, as if the plane had been instantly erased from existence. A massive multinational search operation was launched. For weeks, planes and helicopters scoured the area. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick on a river, no scar in the canopy. The jungle had swallowed the entire aircraft whole, closing over it like water over a sinking stone. The slow burn of risk had escalated into a full-blown, unsolvable mystery. The very technology that was meant to conquer the Amazon, the aircraft that allowed men to look down upon it with impunity, had become just another victim. The sky, it turned out, was not an escape from the jungle's dangers. It was just another layer of the same trap, a vertical extension of the green hell below, where a single mechanical hiccup or a moment of navigational uncertainty could send you plunging into the one place on Earth where a crash site could simply cease to exist. The mapping missions continued, but now every pilot who took off knew the unspoken truth. They were flying over a graveyard, and the occupants of that graveyard had left no markers behind. Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips' 2022 murders in the Javari Valley. The boat was found first. It was a simple, battered aluminum craft, beached and empty on the riverbank. Inside, investigators found a backpack, a laptop, and a pair of boots. There was no sign of a struggle, but there was a single faint bloodstain on the side of the boat. For the families of Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips, this was the moment the world went cold. The 2 men had vanished in the Javari Valley, a sprawling, Portugal-sized expanse of western Amazonian rainforest that is one of the most remote and dangerous places on Earth. To understand how a veteran indigenous expert and an experienced journalist could simply disappear, We have to rewind to the beginning of their final fateful trip. Bruno Pereira was not a tourist. He was a highly respected figure at Brazil's indigenous protection agency, FUNAI. For years, he had been the point man in the Javari Valley, a region home to more uncontacted tribes than anywhere else on the planet. He knew the rivers like the back of his hand, understood the complex and often hostile relationships between different indigenous groups, and, most importantly, he knew the new, deadly threat that was invading the territory: organised gangs of illegal fishermen, poachers and drug traffickers. Bruno had been threatened before. His work involved destroying illegal fishing camps and gathering evidence against the criminals who were plundering the protected land. He was a shield for the vulnerable, and the shield was starting to crack. Dom Phillips was a British journalist who had lived in Brazil for over a decade. He wasn't a thrill seeker, he was a meticulous reporter, there to work on a book about sustainable development in the Amazon. He saw Bruno not just as a source, but as a hero. He wanted to tell the story of the defenders of the forest, the people like Bruno who were standing on the front lines against a tidal wave of destruction. The trip was meant to be a routine journey down the Itaquai River, a chance for Dom to observe Bruno's work and conduct interviews. They were both professionals. They filed a detailed travel plan with authorities, listing their route and their expected return. The trouble began before they even set off. The Javari Valley was becoming a war zone. The previous year, a FUNAI base had been attacked with gunfire. Illegal fishing operations were growing more brazen, armed with high-powered weapons and connected to sophisticated criminal networks. Bruno was acutely aware of the risks. He knew certain stretches of the river were controlled by these gangs. He had received specific recent threats warning him to stay away. But staying away meant ceding ground, leaving the uncontacted tribes and the legal, settled communities at the mercy of the invaders. For Bruno, turning back was not an option. On the morning of June 5, 2022, the two men left the small community of São Rafael in their aluminum boat. They were last seen alive heading downriver. Their plan was to travel to the town of Atalaia do Norte. The journey should have taken a few hours. When they failed to arrive, the alarm was raised quickly. Unlike the historical disappearances of the past, the modern world allowed for immediate action. But the jungle itself had not changed. The search that followed was a frantic race against time. The Brazilian Navy, the federal police and indigenous volunteers all scoured the labyrinthine river system. The empty boat was discovered, a silent, chilling clue. Then, the witnesses began to talk, their voices filtered through fear. Members of a local indigenous patrol, the Guardians of the Forest, reported seeing Bruno and Dom arguing with a group of illegal fishermen on the river just hours before they disappeared. The fishermen had made threats. The picture was coming into focus, and it was an ugly one. After 10 days of searching in a remote area of the forest pointed out by a suspect who had confessed, investigators found the remains. The confirmation came through dental records. Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips were dead. According to the official investigation, they were ambushed and murdered by a group of illegal fishermen, who then dismembered and burned their bodies to hide the evidence. The motive was simple. Bruno was too effective. He was a symbol of resistance, and he had to be eliminated. The cold open that began with an abandoned boat ended with a grim political funeral. But their story did not end in that remote patch of forest. Their deaths ignited international outrage, becoming a symbol of the violent battle for the future of the Amazon. It was a stark modern reminder that the era of exploration is not over. It has just changed its face. The mysteries are no longer about lost cities, but about the bodies of those who dare to protect what remains. The Javari Valley had not swallowed them without a trace. It had delivered a message, written in blood and fire, a message about the price of courage in a world where the frontier is no longer about discovery, but about survival. Dr. Hamilton Rice's 1924 to 1925 expedition. April 12, 1924. Patient 0 is a crew member, Miguel. Symptoms: high fever, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Violent chills, profuse sweating, pupils dilated, complains of blinding headache and severe joint pain, administered quinine. Prognosis: guarded. The entry is clean, precise and unemotional. The handwriting of Dr. Hamilton Rice, a wealthy American physician and explorer, was as steady as his reputation. His 1924 to 1925 expedition was one of the most well-funded and scientifically ambitious journeys into the Amazon. Its goal was to map the vast Rio Branco basin and study tropical diseases at their source. Rice brought a state-of-the-art wireless radio, the latest medical equipment, and a team of seasoned men. He believed that modern science could insulate them from the jungle's oldest threats. His own medical log would become the testament to how wrong he was. The early entries are full of confidence and clinical observation. They made good progress up the Rio Negro. Rice documented the flora and fauna, took blood samples, and treated minor ailments among his crew: cuts, fungal infections, intestinal complaints. He noted the humidity and the insects with a scientist's detachment. "The mosquito population is dense here," he wrote on May 3rd. "A perfect vector for disease. We must be vigilant with the quinine prophylaxis." He was the master of his domain, a man of reason in an unreasonable place. The first crack in this clinical facade appeared subtly. A week later, his entry for a man named Silva was less detached. Silva presents with the same symptoms as Miguel: fever unresponsive to initial quinine dosage. Has begun to hallucinate, calling out for his mother. The fever seems to burn the humanity out of them, leaving only a terrified animal. The problem wasn't just one disease, it was the relentless combination of them. Malaria would weaken a man, then dysentery would dehydrate him, or a bacterial infection from a simple cut would rage into septicemia. Rice's medicine cabinet, once so well stocked, began to look pitifully inadequate. The slow burn of the crisis is charted in the changing tone of the log. The entries become longer, more desperate. He stops using clinical shorthand and starts describing the psychological collapse. June 1st, Carpenter's mate João attempted to walk into the river tonight, claimed it was a road back to his village, required physical restraint. His skin is burning up. I've run out of effective antipyretics. The jungle was no longer just a source of disease. It was an active participant in their undoing, its oppressive heat fueling the fevers, its confusing sameness feeding the delirium. Rice's own health began to falter. He documented his own symptoms with the same brutal honesty. June 18th, I feel the ache in my own bones today. A profound fatigue. Treated a deep gash on my hand from a splintered paddle. Must monitor for infection. The men look to me for confidence, but I find my own is a dwindling resource. The healer was becoming a patient. The leader was losing his strength. The very foundation of the expedition was crumbling. The most haunting entries are not about physical symptoms, but the disintegration of the mind. July 5th. The radio operator, a man named Santos who was always so steady, spent the entire night screaming at phantoms in the trees. He said they were covered in feathers and had red eyes. We had to tie him to his hammock for his own safety. The sound, it curdles the blood. Another man, a seasoned guide, became convinced that the fish in the river were whispering curses in the Tupi language. He refused to eat, fearing poison. Rice's log becomes a chronicle of a floating asylum. The mission of mapping and science was abandoned. The sole purpose was now survival, and they were failing. August 1st, we have lost 3 men in a week. 2 to fever, 1 to drowning after he jumped from the boat convinced it was on fire. I conducted burials in the river. The words of the service felt hollow against the noise of the jungle. The wireless radio, their lifeline to the modern world, was useless. The generator had failed, and the jungle humidity had corroded its delicate parts. They were truly alone. The final entries are the most difficult to read. The precise handwriting has deteriorated into a shaky scrawl. The dates become confused. Day, unknown. Rains continue. More men down. My own fever returns in waves. I find it hard to concentrate. We are turning back, if we can. The last legible entry is a simple, devastating line. The medicine is gone. All that remains is the heat and the waiting. What happened after the log ends is history. Hamilton Rice and a handful of survivors did eventually stagger out of the jungle months later, their health broken, their mission a catastrophic failure. The man who returned was a shadow of the confident physician who had entered. He'd gone in to study disease as a doctor, from the outside looking in. But his own medical log tells a different story. The story of a man who was forced to become a patient in his own nightmare, documenting the slow, feverish unravelling of his team and his own mind, until the only thing left to record was the silence. George Miller Dyott's 1928 search for Fawcett. The first domino was a headline. In 1928, 3 years after Percy Fawcett vanished, the world remained captivated. The mystery demanded a solution. So, When the experienced American explorer and filmmaker George Miller Dyott secured funding for a major expedition to find the lost colonel, it seemed like the logical next step. He was no amateur. He had filmed documentaries in remote corners of the globe. He had a large, well-equipped team, porters, and even a newsreel camera to document his triumph. His confidence was the first and most crucial domino. He believed organisation and modern technology could conquer the same wilderness that had consumed Fawcett. The second domino was a single piece of evidence. Before leaving, Dyott interviewed the few men from Fawcett's final support party. They told him of the colonel's plan to leave a message for any followers, a carved, ceremonial tribal marker, a kuia placed in a specific tree near the Kuluane River. Finding this marker became Dyott's obsession. It was a tangible thread in an intangible mystery. He pushed his team hard, following Fawcett's purported route with a grim determination. When they actually found the carved gourd, exactly where it was supposed to be, it felt like a sign. They were on the right trail. Fawcett was close, but the marker was also a lure, drawing them deeper into the same trap. The third domino was the equipment. Dyott's modern gear, meant to be his advantage, became his burden. The heavy newsreel cameras were useless in the dense undergrowth. Their metal cases rusted shut in the humidity. The extra food supplies attracted insects and rodents. The large team was slow, noisy, and difficult to manage. Every day was a logistical nightmare of breaking camp and setting it up again. The very scale of the operation designed for success made them vulnerable. They were a loud, plodding target for the jungle and its inhabitants, losing the stealth that had been Fawcett's only advantage. The fourth domino was the Kalapalo. Dyott made contact with the same indigenous group that had last seen Fawcett alive. At first, relations were cautious but peaceful. The Kalapalo confirmed the story. They had seen 3 white men, sick and starving. They had given them food and warned them not to go east, into the territory of the hostile Suya people. They said Fawcett had ignored the warning, but as Dyott pressed for more details, the mood shifted. His large party, his cameras, his incessant questions, it all created suspicion. The Kalapalo began to withdraw. Guides melted away into the forest. Information dried up. The cultural bridge that Fawcett had spent years building was collapsing under Dyott's heavy-footed approach. The fifth domino was the river. Running low on supplies and sensing his opportunity slipping away, Dyott made a fateful decision. He would split his party just as Fawcett had. He took a few men in canoes to follow the river east, toward the Suya territory, ordering the rest to wait at the main camp. It was the same calculated risk that had doomed so many before him. The river current was stronger than anticipated. They were quickly carried into unknown menacing country. They saw signs of the Suya, abandoned camps, watching eyes from the riverbank. The tension was a physical weight. Then the weather broke. A storm turned the river into a raging torrent, swamping one of their canoes and losing precious food and ammunition. They were now exposed, weakened, and deep in enemy land. The sixth domino was the realization. Huddled on a muddy bank, Dyott looked at his exhausted, terrified men and understood the truth. He was not Fawcett's saviour. He was his echo. He was reliving the Colonel's final days, just a few years behind. The search had become a grotesque reenactment. To continue was to meet the same unknown end. The decision to turn back was the most difficult of his life, a surrender that would haunt him forever. The journey back to the main camp was a desperate retreat. They were shadowed by the Suya. Nights were spent in a state of terrified vigilance, expecting an attack at any moment. When Dyott's ragged group finally stumbled back into their base camp, they found their own crisis. The men left behind were sick with fever and on the verge of panic, convinced Dyott's party had been wiped out. The expedition was now in tatters, its morale shattered, its purpose defeated. The long, humiliating journey back to civilization was a funeral procession without a body. Dyott returned to the world not with answers, but with a warning. He had gone to find one man and had nearly lost 24 more in the process. The dominoes he had so confidently set up at the start of his journey had all fallen, one by one, until the only thing left standing was the immutable, terrifying truth of the jungle itself, that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and that searching for one ghost often means creating many more. Alexander von Humboldt's harrowing 1799 to 1804 expedition. The first thing Alexander von Humboldt did when he arrived in Cumana, Venezuela in 1799 was to look up. The night sky was unfamiliar, brilliant with southern constellations. For the 29-year-old Prussian aristocrat and polymath, this was the beginning. He had not come for gold or conquest, but for something far more ambitious. He wanted to understand the world. He believed the universe was a single interconnected organism and the Amazon basin was its beating unexplored heart. With him was the French botanist Aimé Bonpland. Their equipment was the best of the Enlightenment: barometers, cyanometers for measuring sky blueness, sextants and electrometers. They were prepared for everything, except for how the jungle would slowly, methodically, test the very limits of their endurance. The first phase of their 5-year expedition was a cascade of wonder. Every day brought a new discovery. Humboldt measured everything: the temperature of ocean currents, the electrical charge of eels, the chemical composition of plants. He and Bonpland collected thousands of specimens. They were the first Europeans to describe the howler monkey, the electric eel, and the carnivorous pitcher plant. Humboldt's journals from this period overflow with exuberant, detailed notes. He felt he was deciphering the very language of nature. The hardships, the heat, the insects, the strange food were minor inconveniences against the backdrop of such boundless knowledge. The first ember of the slow burn began on the Orinoco River. Their goal was to prove the existence of the Cassiquiare Canal, a natural waterway connecting the vast Orinoco and Amazon river systems, a geographical concept most European scientists thought was a myth. The journey was arduous. The dugout canoes were cramped and leaky. The mosquitoes were a living plague. Humboldt, ever the scientist, calculated that in a single cubic foot of air over the river, there were 3,000 mosquitoes. The bites became infected. Fevers set in. Bonpland nearly died after being pinned underwater by a fallen tree during a storm. The wonder began to curdle into a grim respect for the power of the environment. The next test was the land itself. To reach the Andes and his eventual ascent of Mount Chimborazo, Humboldt chose a route through the labyrinthine jungles of the upper Amazon basin. The forest here was different, denser, darker, more oppressive. The trails, when they existed at all, were maintained by indigenous guides who moved with a quiet efficiency that the Europeans could never match. Progress was measured in yards per day. Their supplies, meticulously packed, were ruined by damp and consumed by insects. They ran low on food, forced to rely on the knowledge of their guides to find edible plants and fruits. The slow, grinding reality of survival began to eclipse the thrill of discovery. The psychological toll accumulated like the daily rainfall. The isolation was profound. For weeks at a time, they were utterly cut off from the world they knew. Humboldt's letters, which he wrote obsessively with no way to send them, began to reveal a shifting mindset. The interconnected world he sought to understand started to feel hostile. He wrote of the tyranny of the organic, the feeling that life here was too prolific, too aggressive, a constant struggle for light and space that mirrored his own struggle to simply move forward. The jungle was no longer a subject for study, it was an adversary. The physical dangers escalated from inconvenience to near catastrophe. While collecting plants along the Rio Negro, Bonpland was stricken with a violent fever that left him delirious for days. Humboldt, fighting his own illness, had to nurse him back to health with dwindling medical supplies. On another occasion, their canoe was attacked by a swarm of carnivorous fish, the tiny but fearsome piranhas. The incident was brief but terrifying, a reminder that death here could come in an instant from any direction. The slow burn was intensifying, each incident layering onto the last, eroding their initial optimism. The climax of this accumulation came not in the jungle, but on the mountains that bordered it. Humboldt's record-breaking ascent of Chimborazo was the symbolic peak of his journey, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Suffering from altitude sickness, his feet bleeding through his boots, he was forced to turn back just short of the summit. The man who had wanted to see the connections between all things was confronted with his own profound physical limits. The descent was agony. He returned to the jungle floor not as a conqueror, but as a broken man, his body a testament to the cumulative punishment of 5 years of relentless travel. When Humboldt and Bonpland finally returned to Europe in 1804, they were hailed as heroes. They brought back a treasure trove of data that would reshape Western science. But the men who returned were not the same bright-eyed idealists who had left. Humboldt was plagued by ill health for the rest of his life. The slow burn of the Amazon, the fevers, the starvation, the constant grinding stress had permanently damaged his constitution. He had achieved his impossible dream, mapping the connections of the natural world, but the cost was etched into his face and his body. The jungle had given him the keys to understanding the planet, but it had taken a part of his own life in return. The Madeira-Mamore railway construction 1907 to 1912. The first domino was a map. In the feverish height of the Amazon rubber boom, a single glaring logistical problem threatened the profits of the Bolivian elite. Their rubber, harvested from the remote forests of the north, had no efficient route to the outside world. The only way out was a treacherous journey down the Madeira and Mamore rivers, a series of over 300 kilometres of impassable rapids, waterfalls, and whirlpools known as the Devil's Cauldron. Cargo had to be unloaded, carried overland by mule train, and reloaded onto new boats, a process that was slow, expensive, and dangerous. The solution, drawn on a map in a comfortable office far from the jungle, seemed simple. Build a railway around the rapids. It was the first fateful push. The second domino was the contract. In 1907, the American tycoon Percy Fawcett, through his Brazil Railway Company, won the monumental concession. The plan was audacious: to lay 366 kilometres of track through some of the most hostile and unexplored terrain on Earth. The project was hailed as a triumph of modern engineering, a key that would unlock untold wealth. Engineers arrived from the United States and Europe, their blueprints and steam shovels representing the pinnacle of industrial might. They could not have known they were building a tomb. The third domino was the environment. The chosen route was a narrow corridor of pure nightmare. On one side, the treacherous river, on the other, impenetrable jungle. The air was thick with malaria and yellow fever. The ground was swampy and unstable. The first task was simply to clear the land. Workers from the dry, high plains of northeastern Brazil, known as sertanejos, arrived by the thousands. They were strong, desperate men seeking work. They were utterly unprepared for the reality that greeted them. They called the place Cemitério dos Estrangeiros, the foreigners' cemetery. The name was prophetic. The fourth domino was disease. It began almost immediately. Mosquitoes swarmed in biblical proportions. Men who were healthy in the morning would be shaking with fever by afternoon, their skin turning yellow, their bodies racked with pain. There were no effective treatments. The hospital tents, meant to be a place of recovery, became charnel houses. The death toll was so high that the railway company built its own cemetery before it laid 10 miles of track. A macabre saying began to circulate among the workers: 1 man per tie. It was not an exaggeration. To lay a wooden railway tie, a man had to clear the land, and in clearing the land he was exposed to the diseases that lived in it. The connection was literal. The fifth domino was the supply chain of labour. As men died by the dozens, then by the hundreds, more were shipped in to replace them. The company recruited across Brazil, the Caribbean, and even brought in indentured workers from Barbados. They were all fed into the same meat grinder. The work was brutal, blasting rock, digging foundations in the swamp, fighting off jaguars and venomous snakes. The food was often rotten, the water contaminated. Accidents were constant and gruesome. Men were crushed by falling trees, mangled in machinery, or buried alive in collapsing trenches. The jungle itself seemed to be fighting back against this metallic intruder. The sixth domino was the descent into hell. As the death toll mounted, discipline broke down. Mutinies were common. Men tried to desert only to be lost and killed in the jungle or hunted down by company guards. The project became a byword for suffering. The initial engineering triumph was now a grim, grinding slaughter. The very purpose of the railway, to speed the transport of rubber, was becoming moot as the boom began to bust, undercut by the more efficient plantations in Southeast Asia. But the machine had its own momentum. It kept consuming lives long after its economic rationale had vanished. The final domino fell in 1912. After 5 nightmarish years and an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 lives lost, the Madeira-Mamore Railway was completed. It was immediately dubbed the Devil's Railway. A single symbolic train made the inaugural journey. But the world had changed. The rubber boom was over. The railway, built at such an unimaginable human cost, was almost useless from the day it opened. It ran sporadically for a few decades, a ghost train on a track of bones, before being finally abandoned to the jungle, which quickly began to reclaim its territory. The chain of events that began with a line on a map ended with a rusting scar through the forest and a river valley haunted by the ghosts of thousands. The railway was not just a failure of engineering or economics, it was a catastrophic domino effect of ambition colliding with reality. Each decision, to build, to recruit, to press on despite the death, triggered the next more terrible consequence, until the river of death had swallowed an army of men, leaving behind only a ruined track and a chilling testament to the price of progress. Exploration photographer's death in 1930s. The camera was found before the body. It was a heavy professional thing, a Leica, lying half buried in the mud near a small tributary of the Jaguar River. The Brazilian soldiers who found it in 1932 were part of a routine patrol, and at first they assumed it was just another piece of junk left behind by a failed rubber tapper. But when they pried it open, the film inside was intact. When developed, the photographs told a story more chilling than any report. The final images were a blur of shaking close-up foliage and a dark, looming canopy, as if the photographer had fallen while still pressing the shutter. The last frame was a stark, upward shot of the jungle canopy, a circle of green light at the centre, like an eye closing forever. To understand how the camera of Leonard Williams ended up in the mud, we have to rewind to the beginning of his journey. Leonard Williams was not an explorer in the traditional sense. He was an artist, one of the first professional photographers dedicated to capturing the Amazon not as a hostile frontier, but as a place of sublime beauty. Hired by a British Geographical Society in 1930, his mission was to create a portfolio of images that would showcase the region's grandeur and its indigenous cultures. He was a quiet, meticulous man, more comfortable behind a lens than wielding a machete. He believed that if people could see the Amazon's beauty, they would be moved to protect it. He saw his camera as a tool for preservation. His early photographs from the trip are stunning. They show majestic rivers at dawn, shrouded in mist. They capture the intricate details of a butterfly's wing, the wise, weathered face of a tribal elder, the graceful form of a canoe gliding through black water. His letters home to his fiancée Eleanor are filled with excitement. "The light here is like nowhere else on Earth," he wrote. "It filters through the canopy in great golden pillars. I feel I'm not taking pictures but receiving them as gifts from the forest itself." He travelled with a small team of local guides, moving from village to village, his reputation as a harmless picture taker often granting him access where other outsiders were feared. The first sign of trouble was subtle. In a letter dated mid-1931, the tone begins to shift. "The rains have been relentless for weeks. The humidity is playing havoc with my equipment and with my lungs. I've developed a wretched cough that will not subside." His photographs from this period become darker, more claustrophobic. There are fewer wide, majestic river scenes and more images of the dense, tangled undergrowth, the gnarled roots of mangroves, the dark water of stagnant pools. The beauty was still there, but it was becoming a darker, more oppressive kind of beauty. His guides began to grow nervous. They warned him about venturing too far up the smaller tributaries, areas known to be home to isolated and hostile tribes, or simply so remote that a twisted ankle could be a death sentence. But Williams was driven. He was determined to find a rumoured waterfall, a spectacular cascade that no outsider had ever photographed. It was to be the centrepiece of his collection. Against the advice of his head guide, a man named Luis, he insisted on pushing further up the Rio Charrua. This decision, the first domino in a short, fatal chain, would sever his last connection to safety. The argument was his undoing. Luis and the other men, fearing for their lives, refused to go further. They agreed to wait at a designated spot for 3 days. If Williams did not return, they would assume the worst and go back for help. Williams, believing his artistic mission was more important than their superstitions, took a single young guide who needed the extra money and set off alone. His final photograph before the split shows Luis's worried face, half in shadow, a portrait of impending doom that Williams was too focused to see. What happened over the next 2 days is pieced together from the camera's timeline and the account of the young guide, who barely made it back alive. They found the waterfall. Williams spent a day photographing it from every angle. The images are among his most beautiful, a powerful rush of white water against emerald green. But on the return journey, Williams fell. The young guide said he slipped on a mossy rock, tumbling down a steep embankment and into the river. He emerged coughing, His camera miraculously kept dry, but his leg was badly injured. He could barely walk. The slow-motion tragedy then unfolded. The guide tried to help him, but Williams was a large man and this terrain was brutal. They were moving at a snail's pace. Williams's cough worsened, turning into a fever. The final series of photos tell the story his guide could not. They are a descent into delirium. There are out-of-focus shots of tree roots, extreme close-ups of leaves, the camera shaking violently. He was still trying to work, to document, but his world was collapsing into a fever dream. The last clear image is a self-portrait taken at arm's length. His face is pale, beaded with sweat, his eyes wide with a realization that is dawning just as the shutter clicks. Behind him, the jungle is a solid, impassable wall of green. The young guide, realizing they would both die if he stayed, made the agonizing decision to run for help. He left Williams with most of their water and promised to return. When he finally led a search party back to the spot 2 days later, they found only the camera, lying in the mud near the riverbank. Of Leonard Williams there was no sign. The jungle had closed over him completely. His final haunting portfolio was developed in London a year later. The public marvelled at the beauty of the waterfall and shuddered at the chilling sequence of his end. He had achieved his goal. He had captured the true face of the Amazon. But the final portrait in the collection was not of the jungle, but of a man being swallowed by it, his own lens becoming a window into his final terrifying moments. The 1980s to 1990s narco trafficking route. The two men had never met, and if they had, one would have likely tried to kill the other. Yet, in the endless green of the Amazon in 1989, their fates became twisted together in the same damp, suffocating knot. One was a pilot named Carlos, flying a battered Cessna loaded with 500 kilos of processed cocaine. The other was a DEA agent named Mark, huddled in the back of a Brazilian federal police helicopter, tracking a blip on a radar screen. Both were professionals at the peak of their skills. Both believed they were in control, and both were about to learn the same brutal lesson, that the jungle played by its own rules, and it didn't care which side you were on. Carlos's story was one of cold calculation. His was not an expedition of discovery, but of logistics. The cartels had turned the Amazon into a covert highway. Their runways were hidden strips of cleared forest, invisible from the air. Their supply depots were remote river camps manned by armed guards. Carlos knew the risks, not from the jungle, but from the authorities. He flew at night using night vision goggles, navigating by the faint, silvery threads of rivers under the moonlight. His plane was modified for fuel efficiency and short takeoffs. He was a ghost in the machine, a vital cog in a multi-billion-dollar industry. His only fear was a storm that could ground him, or the sudden appearance of police lights in the darkness. Mark's story was one of frustrated pursuit. From his desk in Bogotá, the intelligence painted a clear picture. Tons of drugs were moving through the Amazon basin. But on the ground, the reality was a frustrating fog. The jungle swallowed evidence. Witnesses were intimidated or disappeared. His mission, Operation Ghost Trail, was to disrupt the aerial pipeline. It meant long, grueling hours in unmarked helicopters, flying dangerous low-altitude patterns over thousands of square miles of trackless forest, chasing whispers and satellite phone intercepts. His fear was a mechanical failure over the canopy, or a lucky shot from a cartel guard on the ground that would send his aircraft spiralling down into the green. The parallel narratives began to converge on a stormy night in March. Carlos was on his most important run, a direct flight from a hidden strip in Colombia to a transshipment point in Brazil. The payload was worth more than he could ever spend. But as he crossed into Brazilian airspace, the weather that had been his ally turned against him. A cell of thunderstorms, not on his forecast, erupted with violent force. Turbulence slammed his plane. Icing formed on his wings. The engine sputtered. The sophisticated navigation equipment flickered and died. The machine that was his ticket to wealth was becoming his coffin. He was losing altitude, and the endless blackness below offered no place to land. At that same moment, Mark's helicopter was grounded at a remote army outpost. The storm was too severe to fly. He stared at the radar screen, watching the blip that was Carlos's plane begin to behave erratically. They had been tracking him for an hour. They watched as the blip started to descend, then began to circle, a sure sign of a pilot in trouble. Then it vanished. Not from being turned off, but from the screen entirely. The storm, the jungle, and sheer bad luck had done what the DEA had failed to do for months. It had taken Carlos out of the sky. The next phase of the parallel story was survival. Carlos survived the crash. The Cessna tore through the canopy, its wings sheared off by 100-foot trees, the fuselage slamming into the soft muddy ground. He was alive but badly injured, his leg broken, surrounded by 500 kilos of a product that was now utterly worthless. His state-of-the-art satellite phone was crushed. He had a pistol, a canteen, and no idea where he was. The man who had flown over this green hell for years was now buried in its belly. The cartel would not look for him. He was a liability. Mark's team launched at first light. The storm had passed, leaving the forest steaming. They flew to the last known coordinates. From the air, they saw nothing. The canopy was unbroken. The jungle had already sealed the wound. They landed at a nearby river and began a ground search. It was slow, miserable work. The humidity was a physical weight. Insects swarmed them. They found no path, no sign of a crash. They were looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a small country. Mark, the hunter, was now just another man lost in the woods, his technological advantage rendered useless by the sheer, overwhelming density of life. Days passed. Carlos's food ran out. His wound became infected. He tried to follow a stream, but the undergrowth was impassable. He fired his pistol twice, a futile signal against the immense silence. The sounds of the search helicopter faded in and out, always tantalizingly close, yet never close enough. He died on the 5th day, curled up at the base of a giant kapok tree, his body just a few hundred yards from a river that would have led him to safety. The jungle had consumed him as indifferently as it consumed a fallen leaf. Mark's team called off the search after a week. They had found nothing. The file for Carlos was marked, "Missing, presumed dead." The 500 kilos of cocaine were written off as a loss. For Mark, it was a hollow, unsatisfying end. There was no arrest, no seizure, no intelligence gained, just a silent green victory for the wilderness. The two men, the trafficker and the agent, had been players in a global war, but in the end they were both just temporary visitors in a place that tolerated no masters. The Amazon had been the true victor, enforcing its own brutal justice on both sides of the law. The missionary expeditions to uncontacted tribes, 1950s to 1970s. September 12th, 1955. We have made contact with the A people. They are wary, but they accepted our gifts of cloth and machetes. They call themselves the Tsunami. I believe God has opened a door here. We will proceed with caution and with faith. The handwriting is neat, hopeful. The author is Reverend James Elliott, a young missionary from Ohio. His letters home to his supporting church, preserved in a small archive, are not the notes of an explorer or a scientist. They are the chronicle of a soul, a man who believed he was on a divine assignment to bring the gospel to a people who had never heard the name of Jesus. For Elliott and his wife Clara, the Amazon was not a green hell, it was a field of souls ripe for harvest. Their own words would become the record of how that harvest turned to tragedy. The early letters are filled with a sense of purpose and wonder. They built a small house on the riverbank, near the territory of the Tsunami people, a tribe known to be isolated and occasionally hostile. James writes of the beauty of the jungle mornings, the kindness of a few initial contacts, and the slow, patient work of learning the language. Clara's letters to her women's group back home describe their simple life, the challenges of keeping food from spoiling and her prayers for the Tsunami women and children. They are so beautiful, she writes, and so lost. We must show them the light. Their confidence was built on a foundation of unwavering faith. The first shadow falls subtly. After months of friendly exchanges, the mood of the Tsunami shifts. In a letter dated February 1956, James's tone is confused. The gifts were refused today. The men would not look me in the eye. Our main contact, a man we call K, has not visited for a week. I fear we have transgressed some unknown custom. We pray for wisdom. The cultural chasm, which they believed they were bridging, was proving to be deeper and more complex than they had imagined. The language of faith was not translating. The letters become a record of rising tension. The Tsunami begin to perform intimidating rituals near their compound, their faces painted, their chants carrying through the forest at night. Clara writes, "The noise is frightening. James says it is just their way, but I lie awake listening. It does not sound like worship. It sounds like a warning." Their initial optimistic contact now feels like a fragile truce that is beginning to fray. They are alone, days from the nearest other outsiders, and the circle of their safe world is shrinking. James's faith begins to take on a desperate edge. His letters home start to include more scripture, more pleas for prayer. He interprets the hostility as spiritual warfare, a direct battle for the souls of the tsunami. "The enemy does not want this stronghold to fall," he writes in April 1956. "We feel the oppression, but our God is greater. We will not retreat." The decision to stay, the critical domino, is framed as a test of their devotion. To leave would be to admit defeat not just to the jungle, but to Satan himself. The last surviving letter from Clara is heartbreaking. Dated May 3rd, 1956, it is filled with a mother's fear. "Little Samuel has a fever. The medicine we brought is gone. The tsunami will not give us any of their remedies. James says God will provide. I try to have his faith, but when I look at my son's flushed face, my heart fails me. I'm so tired of the noise and the fear." The practical reality of their situation, sickness, isolation, and the withdrawal of the very people they came to save, is colliding with their theological certainty. The final communication from the Elliott mission was a shortwave radio transmission, logged by a ham radio operator in Manaus on May 10th, 1956. James Elliott's voice, usually calm and measured, was strained. "This is Elliott at the tsunami station. We're in need of immediate assistance. There are men with weapons outside the compound. They have set fire to the storage shed. Please, if anyone can hear this, pray for us. They are breaking down the transmission cut off into static." A search party reached the compound 2 weeks later. They found the house burned to the ground. The bodies of James, Clara, and their 5-year-old son Samuel were found in the ruins. There was no doubt it was violence. The tsunami had vanished back into the forest. The story that eventually filtered out from other friendly tribes was that the missionaries had unknowingly broken a fundamental taboo, likely by a woman, Clara, touching a hunting weapon, or by the child entering a restricted spiritual area. Their attempts to explain their Christian faith were interpreted as arrogance, as a challenge to the tsunami's own spirits. The gifts were seen not as kindness, but as a dangerous spiritual pollution. The letters, carefully bundled and sent back to Ohio, became a relic of a double tragedy. They told the story of two people who truly believed they were offering salvation, and of a people who saw that offer as a threat to their entire world. The Elliots did not die because they were reckless. They died because they were unable to decipher a cultural code they never knew existed. Their final desperate radio call was not just a cry for help. It was the sound of two utterly different realities crashing together in the remote silence of the jungle, with faith and machetes on both sides, and no common language to prevent the inevitable. Nicole Weisenbach's expedition on 2000s. The first rule of studying jaguars is to remember that you're in their home and you're always being watched. For Dr. Nicole Weisenbach, this was not a fear, but a professional mantra. In the early 2000s, her research camp in the Pantanal, the vast wetland that bleeds into the Amazon basin, was a model of modern field science. Motion sensor cameras were strapped to trees. GPS collars transmitted the movements of big cats. Her days were a routine of tracking, observing, and cataloguing. She respected the jaguars, admired their power, and felt a profound privilege in being allowed to witness their secret lives. The slow burn began not with a roar, but with a subtle shift in this delicate balance. The first sign was a change in the data. The GPS points from a mature male she called Shadow started showing a new pattern. Instead of his wide territorial loops, his movements began to tighten, circling closer and closer to the periphery of her camp. At first, Nicole was fascinated. Was he curious about the strange smells and sounds? She noted it in her log as behavioural habituation to human presence. She adjusted her cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of him investigating the edges of her world. She felt a thrill, not fear. The subject was engaging with the observer. The second sign was auditory. The deep coughing grunts of the jaguars, which usually echoed from a respectful distance, began to sound closer at night. Her local assistants, men who had grown up in the region, grew quiet and checked the locks on the storage shed twice. They started carrying machetes on short walks to the river. Nicole dismissed their concerns as superstition. She was a scientist. She understood predator behavior. The cats were likely just following the scent of the capybara and peccary that also ventured near the camp. The slow burn was a gradual increase in pressure, a rising tension that she was rationalizing away. The third sign was visual. The motion sensor cameras started capturing something new. Shadow wasn't just passing through the camp's perimeter, he was pausing. In the ghostly green of the night vision footage, he would stop and stare directly into the lens, his eyes reflecting the IR light with an unsettling intelligence. He was no longer just an animal in its environment. He was a consciousness assessing arrival. Nicole showed the footage to her senior colleague, Dr. Almeida, over a satellite phone call. "He's sizing you up, Nicole," Almeida said, his voice grave. "It's not curiosity anymore. It's calculation." For the first time, a cold knot tightened in her stomach. The incident that transformed the slow burn into a genuine emergency was silent. Nicole was alone at the camp, her assistants having left for a supply run. She was checking a camera trap a half-mile from base, following a well-worn trail. The jungle was quiet, too quiet. She later recalled the feeling of being pinned, a primal sensation that something had fixed its attention on her. She stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw nothing, heard nothing, but the feeling was overwhelming. She slowly backed away, not turning her back until she was within sight of the camp's clearing. That night she slept fitfully, the sounds of the jungle seeming to press in from all sides. The crisis point came a week later. Nicole was tracking a female jaguar along a riverbank when she found the kill. It was a young tapir dragged into the cover of the roots. But it wasn't the kill that froze her blood, it was the tracks. Alongside the female's prints were the larger, deeper tracks of shadow, and they were fresh. As she stood there, a low growl rumbled from the dense foliage ahead, so close she could feel the vibration in her chest. It was answered by another, slightly farther to her left. She was between them. The scientific part of her mind shut down. The primate brain, the prey brain, took over. She didn't run. Running triggers the chase instinct. She backed away slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice, though her throat was tight with terror. She could see flashes of spotted fur moving in the shadows, keeping pace with her. The half-mile back to camp was the longest journey of her life. Every rustle of leaves was a pounce that never came. Every snap of a twig was an attack launched and suspended. She finally broke into the clearing, scrambling into her hut and barring the door, her body trembling with adrenaline. Shadow and the female circled the camp for hours before melting back into the forest. Nicole Weisenbach left the Pantanal 2 days later. Her research was a success. She had documented a profound shift in jaguar behavior, a move from avoidance to assertive assessment. But the cost of that data was her own sense of safety. She'd gone into the jungle to study the predator, and for a few terrifying hours the roles had been reversed. The slow burn of proximity and habituation had culminated in a moment where she was no longer a zoologist behind a lens, but a potential piece of prey in another creature's world, a stark reminder that in the Amazon, the line between observer and participant is terrifyingly thin. James Lynch's 1996 capture. The camera footage was jerky, chaotic. It showed a man, his face smeared with mud and terror, being dragged through a village by warriors with painted bodies and wooden clubs. His expensive high-tech hiking clothes were torn. This was James Lynch, a wealthy American financier, and in the spring of 1996, this grainy video, sold to a news agency by an opportunistic drug runner, became an international sensation. The millionaire explorer had been captured by the same indigenous people he believed held the key to the Fawcett mystery. To understand how a man with virtually unlimited resources ended up a hostage in the green hell, we have to trace the dominoes that fell one by one, leading him from his penthouse to a dirt floor hut. The first domino was a book. Lynch, bored with corporate acquisitions and yachts, had read a dog-eared copy of Exploration Fawcett. He became obsessed. Finding the lost colonel wasn't just an adventure, it was a quest for meaning, a way to trade his sterile world of finance for one of pure, unadulterated purpose. His wealth, which had solved every other problem in his life, would be his greatest asset. He would succeed where others had failed because he could afford the best of everything. The second domino was technology. Lynch poured money into his 1996 expedition. He bought the latest satellite phones, military-grade GPS units, lightweight composite canoes, and high-frequency radios. He hired a large team of experienced Brazilian sertanistas, wilderness guides, and paid them a small fortune. He saw the jungle as a complex business problem. He had the capital, he just needed the right operational plan. His confidence was a bubble, insulating him from the reality that the Amazon had been swallowing well-equipped men for centuries. The third domino was the route. Ignoring the cautious advice of his head guide, an old hand named Ortiz, Lynch insisted on pushing into the territory of the Uru-Yu-Wow-Wow people. Intelligence was vague, but it suggested this isolated tribe might possess artifacts or oral histories about Fawcett. Ortiz argued. He told Lynch the Uru-Yu-Wow-Wow were not a historical archive. They were a proud, defensive people who saw any intrusion as an act of war. Lynch dismissed this as the timidity of a man who thought too small. He had not come this far to turn back at the first sign of risk. The financial domino of his wealth had toppled the experiential domino of his guide's wisdom. The fourth domino was noise. Lynch's expedition was anything but stealthy. The constant chatter on the radios, the buzzing of a small drone he brought for aerial reconnaissance, the size of his party, it all announced their presence for miles. The Uru-Yu-Wow-Wow knew they were coming days before they arrived. While Lynch studied his satellite maps, the tribe studied him, their hunters tracking the noisy, clumsy group as it blundered deeper into their territory. The jungle, which Lynch saw as an obstacle to be overcome, was for the Uru-Yu-Wow-Wow a weapon and a shield. The fifth domino was the encounter. It wasn't an ambush, it was a confrontation. The warriors simply emerged from the forest, surrounding Lynch's camp. They weren't the mythical giants of Fawcett's tales, but they were fierce, resolute, and armed with bows and clubs. Lynch's high-tech gear was useless. A satellite phone can't call in an airstrike. A GPS can't plot a course out of a circle of aimed arrows. The standoff was tense but non-violent, until one of Lynch's younger, nervous porters panicked and raised his rifle. That single, reckless action triggered the capture. The warriors moved with shocking speed, disarming the man and seizing Lynch, the obvious leader. In the confusion, the rest of the team, including Ortiz, fled into the jungle. The final dominoes were humiliation and survival. Lynch was stripped of his fancy gear. He was paraded from village to village, a living trophy demonstrating the tribe's power over the outside world. The video was shot during this time. For 3 weeks he was held, fed meagre rations, and constantly watched. His fortune meant nothing. His business acumen was a joke. He was reduced to the most basic human state, a prisoner hoping to live through the day. The quest for Fawcett was now a pathetic memory. All that mattered was the next sunrise. His release was negotiated by Ortiz, who had made it to a government outpost. The Brazilian authorities, familiar with the Uru-Yu-Wow-Wow, facilitated a exchange. Lynch for a promise that no outsiders would ever return to that sector. He was freed, a broken man, his $1 million expedition a total loss. James Lynch returned to the world a cautionary tale. His story proved that the Amazon's most dangerous predators aren't jaguars or anacondas, but the obsessions of men, and that no amount of money can buy immunity from the consequences of arrogance. The dominoes of wealth, technology, and blind pursuit had fallen in a perfect sequence, leading not to a lost city but to a primitive cage, proving that the ghost of Percy Fawcett was still claiming victims 70 years after he vanished. The 19th century trading expeditions that disappeared without trace. The São João was a familiar sight on the upper reaches of the Tapajos River. A weathered 40-foot wooden river trader, its deck piled high with sacks of salt, bolts of cloth, pots, pans, and fishing hooks. Its captain, a man named Oliveira, had been running the same route for 20 years, from the bustling port of Santarém to the isolated communities that dotted the riverbanks like scattered beads. His was a life of routine and small commerce, a vital thread in the fabric of the river economy. In the dry season of 1887, he loaded his boat as usual, kissed his wife goodbye, and steered the São João away from the dock. The slow burn of his disappearance began not with a storm or an attack, but with the simple, unremarkable passage of time. The first sign was subtle. Oliveira was a creature of habit. he would typically stop at the trading post of Vila Franca, a 3-day journey upriver, to send a message back with a downstream boat. The message was always the same: his progress, the state of the river, and his estimated time of arrival at the next major settlement. The owner of the trading post, a man named Silva, expected the message. When it didn't arrive after 4 days, he assumed Oliveira had been delayed by a mechanical issue or had found a particularly good spot for trading. He made a note in his ledger. It was the first faint flicker of concern, easily dismissed. The second sign was the silence from the communities upriver. A week later, a canoe arrived at Villafranca from a village further north. The villagers asked after Oliveira. They had expected him days ago. They were running low on salt and ammunition. Silva, now more concerned, questioned the canoeist. Had he seen any sign of the São João? Any wreckage? The man shook his head. The river had been quiet. The silence along the trade route was beginning to feel heavy, deliberate. The jungle itself seemed to be holding its breath. The third sign was the lack of debris. Silva organised a small search party. They took a motor launch and headed upriver, following Oliveira's intended route. They moved slowly, scanning the banks for any sign of the boat. A snagged piece of clothing, a floating barrel, an oil slick, anything. They found nothing. The river was clean. It was as if the São João, a substantial vessel with a crew of 5, had been lifted from the water entirely. The sheer normality of the river was now the most abnormal thing of all. The slow burn was the growing realization that the absence of evidence was itself the most terrifying evidence. This pattern was not unique to the São João. The records of the Amazon River trade in the late 19th and early 20th centuries are punctuated with these quiet, unresolved mysteries. The Bom Jesus, a steamer carrying rubber and provisions, vanished on the Madeira River in 1902. The Santa Maria, a trading schooner, disappeared on the Rio Negro in 1911 with a crew of 8. In each case, the story was the same: a routine departure, a missed check-in, a search that found nothing. No splintered wood, no bloated bodies, no cries for help overheard by other boats, just silence. Theories were always plentiful but ultimately useless. Perhaps a sudden microburst storm, a trovoada seca, had capsized the vessel so quickly no one could react, sending it and its crew to the bottom in minutes, where the powerful current and scavenging life would scatter the remains beyond recognition. Maybe the boat had sprung a sudden catastrophic leak, pulling it under before a distress signal could be made. Others whispered of piracy, of rogue bands that would attack isolated traders, kill the crew, steal the cargo, and scuttle the boat, leaving no witnesses. But piracy usually left traces: a discarded personal item, a body washed ashore, rumours in the river ports. These disappearances were absolute. The most chilling possibility was that the river itself was the predator. A submerged log known as a power culto could rip the hull open. The boat would sink in deep water, and the immense sediment-laden river would bury the wreck in mud within days, erasing it from existence. Or a crew, stopping at a seemingly deserted riverbank to make repairs or hunt for food, could be struck down by a sudden fever, a virulent strain of malaria or yellow fever that killed them all within hours. The boat would then drift, a ghost ship, until it eventually snagged on something and sank or washed out to the Atlantic to break apart, its story forever lost. The slow burn of these tragedies was not in a single dramatic event, but in the agonizing wait for families back in Santarém or Belém, the hope that would stubbornly flicker for weeks, then months, the sight of every riverboat arriving at the dock, and the crushing disappointment when it was not the one they waited for. The official inquiries would eventually close, citing cause unknown. The names of the boats and their crews would be added to a long, grim list, a ledger of the swallowed. The São João and the hundreds of vessels like it never sent a distress call. They never fired a warning shot. They simply left port on a journey they had made 100 times before, and at some point between one bend in the river and the next, they ceased to exist. Their stories are the quietest of the Amazon's mysteries, not tales of legendary explorers or dramatic mutinies, but of ordinary men on ordinary errands who sailed into the green and never sailed out. The slow, chilling truth they represent is that in the Amazon, even the most routine journey is a gamble, and the river does not need a spectacular reason to claim its toll. It simply needs an opportunity. Carlos Chagas' 1909 expedition that discovered Chagas disease. The first domino was a scientific theory. In the early 1900s, the world was desperate to conquer malaria. The link between mosquitoes and the disease was newly proven, and the Amazon was its global epicenter, a roaring engine of infection that killed thousands every year. In 1909, the brilliant Brazilian physician Carlos Chagas, already famous for discovering the parasitic disease that bears his name, was tasked with leading a major expedition to study malaria's transmission in the remote interior. His mission was clear: find the specific mosquito vectors and break the cycle of disease. It was a noble, urgent goal, but in the Amazon, even the purest of intentions can trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. The second domino was the location. Chagas chose to establish his research station in the heart of the rubber boom territory, along the lawless upper reaches of the Jaguar River. This area had the highest concentration of malaria cases in the world, making it the perfect laboratory. But it was also a place of extreme violence, where rubber barons ruled through terror and indentured labourers died by the thousands. Chagas and his team of doctors and assistants arrived with microscopes, glass slides and vials of chemicals, their scientific instruments seeming fragile against the backdrop of raw human suffering and untamed nature. They were there to study one killer, unaware they were walking into a gallery of them. The third domino was the discovery. While dissecting a local species of bug known as the kissing bug for his ongoing research, Chagas made a stunning unrelated find. He identified a new microscopic parasite in the insect's gut. He would later name it Trypanosoma cruzi, the cause of Chagas disease. It was a monumental breakthrough, one that would cement his legacy forever. But this discovery created a fatal distraction. The mission's focus split. They were now tracking two invisible enemies at once in an environment that tolerated no lack of focus. The fourth domino was the environment itself. The research station was a magnet for sickness. The team lived in a constant humid cloud of insects. Despite their knowledge, they were not immune. The first to fall was Dr. Almeida, Chagas's deputy. He developed a ferocious case of malaria that did not respond to quinine. The fever ravaged him, leaving him delirious and bedridden. Chagas, now torn between his groundbreaking new research and his collapsing team, had to become a bedside caretaker. The microscope, a tool of discovery, now stood witness to the suffering of a friend. The fifth domino was the logistical collapse. With Dr. Almeida incapacitated, the team's workload doubled. They were trying to collect insects, take blood samples from sick rubber tappers, maintain their equipment, and care for their own. The relentless rain rusted their metal instruments. The humidity fogged their microscope lenses. Their supply of quinine, the only anti-malarial drug, was running dangerously low. They had to ration it, choosing who would receive a full dose and who would have to make do with less. The scientists were now making triage decisions, their objective mission corrupted by the immediate struggle for survival. The sixth domino was the introduction of a third killer. While the team was focused on malaria and the new trypanosome, a different, more familiar predator struck: yellow fever. It hit the camp cook first, a local man named Luis. The disease moved with terrifying speed. High fever, jaundice turning the skin yellow, internal bleeding. He was dead within 3 days. Panic erupted. The team was now under siege from 3 distinct diseases, each with its own symptoms, transmission method, and mortality rate. Their scientific knowledge became a curse. They understood exactly how each disease was progressing through their bodies and their camp, and they were powerless to stop it. The final domino was the retreat. Chagas himself began to show symptoms of malaria. Shivering in his cot, he looked around at his decimated team. Dr. Almeida was a skeleton, coughing blood. 2 assistants were down with dysentery. Another was showing the early signs of yellow fever. The mission to conquer disease had been defeated by disease itself. They had made one of the most important medical discoveries of the century, but they were too sick to celebrate, too broken to continue. They abandoned the station, carrying their sick on stretchers through the mud, a ragged procession of failure. Carlos Chagas survived. He returned to civilization and announced his discovery of the new disease, a triumph that overshadowed the tragic cost. But the expedition was a brutal lesson in the domino effect of Amazonian medicine. The quest to understand one plague had led to the discovery of another, which in turn had exposed them to a third, until the weight of multiple invisible enemies crushed their scientific resolve. They had gone in to study the mechanisms of death, and had nearly become its permanent residents. The chain of events proved that in the Amazon, even a mission of healing could become a death sentence, and that for every mystery of disease solved, the jungle holds a dozen more in reserve, waiting for the next curious mind to trigger their fall. Richard Spruce's shipwreck on 1852, January 12, 1852, a productive day, collected 3 new species of butterfly and documented a previously unrecorded pollination behaviour in a canopy orchid. The specimens are carefully packed and labelled. 4 years of work are in these crates, a testament to the glory of creation. I feel content. The journal entry is written in a steady, confident hand. The author is Alfred Russel Wallace, a British naturalist in the midst of an ambitious 4-year expedition across the Amazon basin. He's a contemporary and friend of Henry Walter Bates, and like him, Wallace is driven by a burning curiosity about the origin of species. His journals and letters, much like Bates's, are a window into the mind of a scientist, but they are also about to become the record of a shattering loss that would test his spirit in ways the jungle's physical dangers never could. The early writings reveal a man in his element. Wallace is methodical, passionate, and endlessly patient. He collects birds, insects, and plants with a meticulous eye. He spends weeks observing a single species of ant, documenting its social structure. His notes are filled with the same wonder as his colleagues. The sheer variety is overwhelming, he writes in 1850. It is as if nature is experimenting endlessly, trying every possible form and function. I am merely her humble scribe. He's building a treasure trove of evidence, crates of carefully preserved specimens that he believes will revolutionize natural science. The first hints of strain are subtle, buried in letters to his family. He writes of the loneliness, of missing intelligent conversation. He describes the financial pressure he is under, having funded the expedition largely through the sale of duplicate specimens sent back to London. His entire future depends on the success of this collection. The physical hardships are ever present: fevers, insect bites, dangerous river crossings, but he endures them with a stoic determination. The work is his anchor. In the middle of 1851, a more sombre tone emerges. He receives news that his younger brother, Herbert, who had joined him in the Amazon, has died of yellow fever. Wallace's journal entry is brief, the handwriting tighter, the words stripped of all scientific flourish. Herbert is gone. Buried him at the mouth of the Rio Negro. I'm now entirely alone. The expedition is no longer just a scientific quest, it is a personal trial. He throws himself into his work with a new, almost desperate intensity. The crates of specimens become his legacy, his brother's memorial, and his only remaining tether to the world he left behind. Finally, after 4 years of relentless work, hardship, and personal tragedy, the time comes to return to England. It is July 1852. Wallace boards the merchant brig Helen, his health broken but his spirit sustained by his priceless cargo. The ship is packed with his life's work, dozens of crates containing thousands of specimens, his detailed journals and field notes, live animals in cages and sketches of maps and species. He has notebooks filled with the nascent ideas that would later lead him, independently of Darwin, to the theory of evolution by natural selection. All of it is on this one ship. For the first 3 weeks of the Atlantic crossing, the voyage is smooth. Wallace spends his time organising his notes, dreaming of the scientific sensation his collection will cause. Then, on the 6th of August, the smell of smoke seeps into his cabin. The following journal entry, written days later on a lifeboat, is a raw, jagged scrawl, a document of pure psychological ruin. It is all gone, everything. The fire started in the forecastle. The captain said there was no stopping it. The tar and oakum between the planks caught like kindling. The ship became a furnace. I stood on the deck and watched the flames consume my cabin. I saw the crates, my birds, my insects, my plants, catch fire. 4 years. 4 years of my life. The new species, the records, the maps, the proof. All of it turning to ash and smoke. I could only watch. There was nothing to be done. We took to the boats. I saved nothing but this journal and the clothes on my back. The Helen burned for 10 hours before she sank. I watched the glow on the horizon until it vanished, taking my work, my future, and my brother's memory to the bottom of the sea. I am adrift, not just on this boat, but in my soul. I have nothing to show for it all, nothing. For 10 days, Wallace and the other survivors drifted in an open boat before being rescued by a passing vessel. The physical ordeal was horrific. Thirst, hunger, exposure. But it was the psychological devastation that truly broke him. He had faced Jaguars, starvation and disease without flinching, but the loss of his work, the annihilation of his intellectual legacy, was a blow from which he feared he would never recover. When he finally returned to England in October 1852, he was a different man. He was penniless, and more painfully, he was empty-handed. The scientific community received him with sympathy, but it was the sympathy reserved for a victim of a catastrophe, not for a returning hero. The man who had written so eloquently about the glory of creation now wrote to a friend, "I feel as if I've returned from the dead, only to find my life's purpose was buried at sea." Alfred Russel Wallace would of course go on to rebuild his life and his reputation. He would travel to the Malay archipelago and from scratch assemble another magnificent collection that would lead him to his theory. But the shadow of the burning Helen always remained. His Amazonian writings are a unique and heartbreaking record, not just of discovery, but of absolute loss. They are the survivor's account of a man who endured the jungle's worst, only to have his victory stolen by a random spark in a ship's hold. A stark reminder that in the quest for knowledge, the greatest danger is sometimes not the wildness of nature, but the fragility of human endeavour. Brazilian Border Patrol expeditions from 1960s to 1970s. The official report called it a training accident. The Internal Army memo, classified for 50 years, used a different term: mass desertion under duress. In the humid archives of the Brazilian military, the story of the 1968 4th Border Patrol Battalion's expedition into the Vale do Javari exists in two parallel versions. One is the clean, sanitized record of a mission to map a remote frontier. The other, pieced together from whispered accounts and a few court-martial transcripts, tells a story of a unit that simply dissolved into the green, its soldiers choosing the unknown perils of the jungle over the certain hell of their command. The first narrative is that of Lieutenant Acevedo, a young, by-the-book officer fresh from the military academy. His mission was straightforward: lead a platoon of 30 men on a 60-day reconnaissance patrol along a disputed section of the border with Peru. They were to map trails, document any illegal incursions, and show the flag. In his official dispatches radioed back to headquarters, the tone is professional and optimistic. Day 12. Made contact with friendly settlement. Morale is high, proceeding as scheduled. He believed in discipline, hierarchy, and the righteousness of his duty. The jungle was an obstacle to be overcome with grit and regulation. The second narrative belonged to the men themselves, particularly a corporal named Silva, a conscript from the drought-stricken northeast. For Silva and his comrades, the army was a way out of poverty, but this expedition felt like a death sentence. The lieutenant, inexperienced and nervous, pushed them too hard, too fast. Their packs were too heavy, their rations too meagre. The jungle was not an obstacle. It was a waking nightmare of insects, suffocating heat, and strange, frightening noises. Silva's story, told much later to an anthropologist, described the growing resentment. The lieutenant cared only about his maps. He didn't care that men were getting sick, that their boots were rotting off their feet. He threatened to court-martial anyone who fell behind. The parallel narratives began to violently converge around day 28. In his dispatch, Lieutenant Azevedo reported, encountered hostile indigenous group, exchanged warning shots. One man, Private Costa, separated during the engagement. Search ongoing. The official record showed a soldier lost in a skirmish, but according to Silva there were no hostiles. Private Costa had simply snapped. Exhausted and feverish, he had thrown down his rifle and walked into the jungle, refusing to go on. The lieutenant, furious at this insubordination, had fired his pistol into the air. Costa kept walking and disappeared into the foliage. He was listed as missing in action. The unit marched on, but a line had been crossed. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. The platoon was lost. Azevedo's maps were useless, his compass readings confused by mineral deposits. Morale had collapsed. Men were suffering from dysentery, malaria, and festering wounds. In his final frantic radio transmission, Azevedo reported, heavy rainfall, position uncertain, multiple men unfit for duty, request immediate extraction. Headquarters promised a helicopter in 48 hours. But for the men, 48 hours was a lifetime. That night, the mutiny happened. It wasn't a violent uprising, it was a quiet dissolution. According to Silva, he and a small group of soldiers simply decided they would not march another step for the lieutenant. They told him they were staying put. Azevedo, isolated and terrified, brandished his sidearm, but the defiance in the men's eyes was absolute. In the darkness, a larger group of soldiers, hearing the argument, made their own choice. They melted away into the forest, abandoning their heavy packs and weapons, preferring to take their chances with the jungle rather than with their commander. The parallel stories now split completely. Lieutenant Azevedo was found 5 days later by the rescue helicopter, delirious with fever, alone in a makeshift lean-to. He was medically evacuated and later received a quiet transfer to a desk job. His official report detailed a heroic stand against impossible odds and the tragic loss of his men to disease and hostile action. The other story, the story of the deserters, is fragmented. Some were never seen again, presumed dead, but a handful, including Corporal Silva, survived. They encountered a small nomadic tribe of Matis people. Instead of attacking, the Matis, seeing their pitiful state, took them in. Silva and 2 others lived with the tribe for over a year. They learned to hunt with blowpipes, to identify edible plants, and to see the jungle not as an enemy, but as a home. They shed their military identities like a second skin. When they eventually made contact with a rubber tapper and turned themselves in, they were barely recognizable as soldiers. The army, to avoid a scandal, quietly court-martialed them for desertion and then discharged them. Their story was buried. The official narrative of the lost patrol became a minor footnote in military history. But the parallel truth of the 1968 expedition lived on in the memories of the survivors. It was a story of a different kind of breakdown, not of men against nature, but of men against a system that failed them. The jungle had offered them a strange kind of asylum, and in their mutiny they had found a perverse freedom, proving that sometimes the most radical survival strategy is not to conquer the wild, but to disappear into it completely. Modern survival show incidents and crew near-deaths from 2000s to 2010. The footage is shaky, blurred by rain and panic. A man, his face a mask of mud and terror, is screaming into a satellite phone. "The host is gone, do you understand? He just walked into the jungle and didn't come back. We need a rescue now, not tomorrow, now!" In the background, other crew members are arguing. One is vomiting from anxiety, and the jungle is a solid, soaking green wall behind them. This was not in the script. This was the unaired, raw footage from the 3rd season of the survival reality show Savage Planet. To understand how a multi-million-dollar production with safety protocols and insurance waivers descended into this chaos, we have to rewind to the beginning of their shoot. The concept was simple and a proven ratings winner. A celebrity survivalist, ex-military and known for his tough guy persona, would be dropped into a remote part of the Amazon for 2 weeks. He would demonstrate survival skills while a crew of 15, camera operators, sound technicians, producers and a medic, would discreetly film his ordeal from a base camp. The danger was meant to be manufactured, controlled. The host, a man named Jake Rocket Rocco, had been through survival training. The crew had state-of-the-art communication gear, GPS trackers, and a helicopter on standby just an hour away. It was adventure as a product, and they were there to package it. The first few days went according to plan. Rocco built a shelter, demonstrated how to find water, and wrestled a small caiman for the cameras. The crew, while uncomfortable in the humidity and plagued by insects, felt secure in their bubble of technology. Their base camp was a cluster of weatherproof tents with generator power. They had a chef. They had a stash of candy bars. The jungle was a set and they were just off camera. The first crack in this facade appeared on day 5. The weather turned. A storm system, not in the forecast, settled over the region. The rain was torrential, ceaseless. The river near their camp began to rise fast. The producer, a woman named Sarah, made the call to move the base camp to higher ground. It was a logistical nightmare in the pouring rain. Equipment was soaked despite protective covers. Tempers flared. The constant damp seeped into everything, causing electrical shorts in their cameras and draining batteries at an alarming rate. The comfortable bubble was popping. The second crack was Rocco himself. Isolated, wet and sleep-deprived, his carefully constructed persona began to fray. He started making riskier moves for the camera, venturing further from his designated area. He refused to use the emergency rations that were secretly placed near his camp, insisting on a pure experience. The film crew, tasked with following him, were pushed to their limits. They were no longer just documenting a survival story, they were participants in a deteriorating situation. The crisis point, the moment the cold open captures, happened on day 10. Rocco, during a filming segment, declared he was going to find a specific type of medicinal plant he claimed was a day's hike to the east. The director, speaking to him through a hidden earpiece, told him it was too dangerous, that the weather was too bad and the GPS signals were unreliable. Rocco, in a fit of what the crew later called method survivalism, ripped out his earpiece and threw it into the river. He looked directly into the camera, said, "The show starts now," and walked into the undergrowth. The crew was stunned. They waited. An hour passed, then 2. The rain made it impossible to hear anything. His personal GPS tracker, which he was contractually obligated to wear, suddenly stopped transmitting. Whether it failed due to the weather or he disabled it, no one knew. The controlled experiment was now a genuine emergency. The producer, Sarah, made the frantic satellite call that was captured on film. The helicopter was scrambled, but the storm made flying nearly impossible. It would be hours before it could reach them. What the cold open doesn't show are the 12 hours that followed. The crew, now genuinely terrified, huddled in their tents as darkness fell. The jungle, which had been a noisy backdrop, became a symphony of threats. Every sound was a jaguar, every rustle a snake. Their high-tech gear was useless. Their medic treated 2 crew members for panic attacks. They were no longer a television production. They were a group of lost, frightened people. Rocco was found the next morning, not by the helicopter, but by 2 of the local guides. He was 10 miles from camp, disoriented, dehydrated, and suffering from exposure. He had spent the night huddled under a tree, his bravado completely shattered by the genuine indifferent power of the rainforest. The rescue helicopter airlifted him out. The production was shut down immediately. The series was never completed. The network, facing massive lawsuits and a public relations disaster, settled out of court with the crew and buried the footage. The Nightmare on the Savage Planet set became a dark industry legend, a cautionary tale about the hubris of trying to stage manage the wild. It proved that the Amazon doesn't respect contracts, ratings, or celebrity egos. The most terrifying reality they discovered wasn't the one they were trying to create for television. It was the one that waited for them just beyond the edge of the set, ready to swallow their star and their multi-million-dollar production whole. Modern searches for pre-Columbian ruins and lost civilizations. The first domino was a satellite image. On Dr. Evan Reed's computer screen in a California university in 2012, it showed an unnaturally perfect geometric shape hidden under the canopy of the Bolivian Amazon. It looked like a pyramid. For Reed, a respected archaeologist, it was the clue of a lifetime. It wasn't Fawcett's Z, but it was close. It was proof, he believed, of a major pre-Columbian civilization. His decision to mount an expedition to ground truth the site was the first logical step. It was also the first domino in a chain that would lead him down the same obsessive path that had consumed the Colonel a century before. The parallel narrative begins not with Reed, but with his predecessor. In his office, Reed kept a framed yellowed map drawn by Percy Fawcett himself. He saw himself not as repeating history, but as completing it. He had technology Fawcett couldn't dream of: LiDAR, satellite spectroscopy, drones. He believed this technological shield made him immune to the old tragedies. He was wrong. The dominoes began to fall with eerie familiarity. The second domino was funding. Reed's university was hesitant. The area was remote, dangerous, and his evidence was circumstantial. So he turned to private backers, selling his vision with the passion of a true believer. He secured the money, but with it came pressure. The backers wanted results, dramatic ones. The pure scientific quest was now tainted with the need for a return on investment. The ghost of Fawcett, who had also been hounded by his financial backers, loomed large. The third domino was the team. Reed assembled a group of bright young graduate students and a few seasoned local guides. The guides, men whose fathers and grandfathers had tales of the jungle, warned against the specific location. They spoke of the old ones and of a region that was bad medicine. Reed dismissed it as superstition. He was a man of science. His LiDAR scans didn't show bad medicine. They showed the outlines of a city. The team's faith in their leader, much like Jack Fawcett's faith in his father, was absolute and would prove fatal. The parallel narrative quickens. As Reed's team hacked their way towards the coordinates, The story of a previous failed expedition to the same region emerged. In 1998, a Portuguese adventurer named Álvaro Figueiredo had followed similar clues. His story ended when his guide returned alone, claiming Figueiredo had simply walked away from camp one morning and never returned. His body was never found. Reed read the report and saw it as a cautionary tale about poor preparation, not a warning about the place itself. The fourth domino was the terrain. The LiDAR maps were useless on the ground. The geometric shapes from space translated into a nightmare of swamps, thorny vines, and steep, muddy ridges. The drones couldn't fly in the thick canopy. The satellite phones struggled to get a signal. Their progress slowed to a crawl. Supplies began to run low. The first student, a young woman named Chloe, contracted a severe fungal infection that covered her legs in weeping sores. The technological shield was cracking. The fifth domino was the discovery. They found it. Not a city, but a single massive carved stone slab, half sunk in a bog. It was unquestionably man-made and ancient. Reed was ecstatic. This was his proof. He insisted on staying to document it fully, even as their food ran out and the sick student's condition worsened. The obsession had him. The parallel with Fawcett was now complete. The tantalizing proof, the dwindling supplies, the refusal to turn back. The pursuit of the discovery had become more important than the safety of the people making it. The sixth domino fell with the sound of a gunshot. One of the students, desperate for food, tried to hunt a monkey. He stumbled in the mud, and his rifle discharged, shattering his own foot. The crisis was immediate. They were days from help with a critically ill woman and a man with a catastrophic injury. The dream of the lost city evaporated, replaced by the brutal reality of a medical evacuation. The final domino was the retreat. They had to carry the injured man. They abandoned their heavy archaeological equipment, including the tools to properly document the stone slab. Reed took a few hasty photographs. The journey out was a hellish replay of 100 other failed expeditions. They were haunted by the feeling of failure. When they finally reached a river and got a signal to call for help, Reed was a broken man. He had found his proof, but he had nearly gotten his team killed for it. The parallel narratives converged in the aftermath. Reed published a paper on the stone slab, but the archaeological community was skeptical. The photographs were poor, and he had no precise location data. His career never recovered. The injured student sued the university. The story of the 2012 Reed expedition became a minor, sad footnote, a modern echo of an old song. He had followed Fawcett's ghost, armed with satellites instead of sextants, and had been led to the same precipice. The dominoes of obsession, the clue, the pressure, the dismissal of warnings, the fatal choice to press on, had fallen in the same sequence, proving that the jungle doesn't just hide lost cities, it preys on the same human weaknesses century after century, consuming the curious with an unchanging patient hunger. The Javari Valley incidents. There is a place in the western Amazon where the map still says unexplored. It is not a single location, but a vast, tangled region the size of a small country, drained by the Rio Javari and its countless black water tributaries. This is the valley that has swallowed more expeditions than any other place in the Amazon. The story of the Javari is not one of a single dramatic event, but a slow, chilling accumulation of evidence that this particular piece of the earth refuses to be known. The first layer of the slow burn is the geography. The Javari Basin is a labyrinth. The rivers twist back on themselves in such complex meanders that a journey of 10 miles as the crow flies can become a 50-mile slog by boat. The water is the colour of strong tea, stained by tannins, making it impossible to see more than a few inches below the surface. The forest is permanently flooded in vast areas, creating an impenetrable swamp forest known as the Várzea. There are no trails. There is only the river and the endless identical green walls on either side. For any expedition, the first enemy is simply getting anywhere. Progress is measured not in miles per day, but in yards per hour. The second layer is the human element. The Javari Valley has the highest concentration of uncontacted tribes in the world. These are not mythical creatures, but real people who have consciously and violently rejected contact with the outside world for generations. They are masters of their environment, and they see any intrusion as a mortal threat. The first sign of their presence is often subtle. A footprint on a riverbank that wasn't there an hour before. A half-hidden canoe pulled into the undergrowth. the sudden, eerie silence of the forest as you round a bend. This constant, unseen surveillance is a psychological weight that grinds down even the most experienced explorers. You're not alone in the wilderness, you're being watched. The third layer is the lawlessness. The valley's remoteness and impenetrable borders make it a perfect haven for those operating outside the law. In the 1980s and 90s, it was a major route for cocaine traffickers. Today, it is a stronghold for illegal loggers, miners, and poachers. These are not romantic outlaws. They're armed, desperate men who will kill to protect their lucrative operations. An expedition can stumble into a clandestine airstrip or illegal gold mining camp without warning. In the Javari, the danger is not just natural, but human, and it comes with automatic weapons. The slow burn intensifies with the stories. They are not legends, they are reports, filed with the Brazilian authorities and FUNAI, the Indigenous Protection Agency. In 2002, a team of Peruvian drug interdiction officers chased a plane that crashed in the valley. A rescue team found the wreckage, but the crew and the cargo were gone. The area was littered with the footprints of the uncontacted Kurubo tribe. No bodies were ever recovered. In 2015, a documentary crew filming a piece on the Matis tribe had to be evacuated after being surrounded by armed men they believed to be poachers. They abandoned tens of thousands of dollars of equipment. The jungle reclaimed it within weeks. The pressure builds with each modern disappearance. The case of Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips in 2022, detailed earlier, was not an anomaly. It was the logical, brutal conclusion of the Javari's pattern. They were experts, they knew the risks, they had a detailed plan, and still the valley consumed them. Their murders by illegal fishermen were a stark, modern declaration that the rules of the outside world do not apply here. The slow burn had erupted into a very public flame, revealing the ongoing war in the green shadows. The most unsettling aspect of the Javari's slow burn is the silence that follows these events. The searches are called off, the investigations stall, the news cycles move on. The families are left with questions that will never be answered. The river does not give up its secrets. It does not wash bodies ashore or float wreckage to the surface. It absorbs everything. A plane crashes and the canopy closes over it. A boat sinks and the silt covers it. A person walks away from a camp and the undergrowth erases their path within hours. The final, chilling truth of the Rio Javari is that it represents the enduring power of the unknown. In the 21st century, with satellites that can read a license plate from space and instant global communication, this valley remains a black hole. It is a living, breathing reminder that exploration is not a finished chapter in human history. The age of discovery is not over. It has just retreated to the last, most defiant redoubts, places where the rivers have no names and the maps are still blank. The slow burn of the Javari is the cumulative proof that some places on Earth are not meant for people. They are a world apart, a green silence that has been eating expeditions for centuries and shows no sign of stopping. The river flows on, waiting for the next curious soul to test its patience. 25 expeditions, hundreds of missing people, 0 complete explanations, camps found with equipment running and meals half-eaten, explorers discovered decades after disappearing, teams that evaporated without sending a single distress signal. The jungle keeps its secrets with absolute silence. It whispers stories in fragments of journals and abandoned gear, but never reveals the ending. The ghosts remain there, drifting through the green shadows, reminding us that in the vast emerald heart of our planet, some questions still grow without answers.